Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we invite you to leave the noise of the modern world behind as we journey across the vast expanse of time to the sun-drenched plains of the Fertile Crescent. As you settle into your blankets, imagine the air around you growing still, scented with the sweet silt of the riverbanks, flowering date palms, and sun-baked mud brick. Let your breath slow to the steady, eternal pulse of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Feel your muscles relax as if you were reclining on a woven reed mat within a quiet courtyard, safe behind thick walls that have stood since the dawn of the first cities. The land of Mesopotamia is preparing for rest, and it invites you to do the same. Close your eyes, let the oil lamps flicker low against the starlit ziggurats, and prepare to drift into a deep, timeless sleep as we begin our story. The story begins not with a king, but with the silt, the fine, dark mineral dust that serves as the humble ancestor of every empire. For millennia, the mountains of the north bled this sediment into the water, a silent gift carried downstream by two temperamental giants, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers were the twin arteries of the Near East, carving a jagged, winding path toward the shimmering horizon of the Persian Gulf. They were not the gentle, predictable flows of other lands. They were wild, restless, and possessed of a primal power that could reshape the very geography of the world in a single season. To the early inhabitants of these arid plains, the rivers were gods in their own right, as terrifying as they were generous. They were prone to violent, sudden flooding, cataclysmic surges that could roar across the flat landscape without warning, swallowing a family's dwelling and washing away a season's hope in a single afternoon. There was no mountain to climb for safety, only the vast, open expanse of the basin. In these moments of watery chaos, the fragility of human existence was laid bare against the sheer, unbridled force of the Mesopotamian elements. Yet, when the waters finally receded and the roar of the flood turned back into a rhythmic murmur, they left behind a transformative miracle, a layer of slick, wet mud. This was the Black Land, a saturated sludge so rich in nutrients that it offered a promise of life found nowhere else in the parched world. While the surrounding deserts were bone dry and hostile, this narrow ribbon of sludge was a laboratory of growth. It was a canvas upon which the future of the human race would be sketched, provided someone was brave enough to stay and tend to it. It was here, in the curve of the Fertile Crescent, where humanity first made the most significant gamble in its long history. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had been wanderers, following the migration of the gazelle and the ripening of wild grains across the seasons. To stay in one place was to invite starvation once the local resources were spent. But the silt of the rivers offered a different path, a sedentary existence that promised a surplus of food, if and only if the wild rivers could be tamed. This gamble required a radical trade, the nomadic freedom of the past for the stationary, back-breaking toil of the plow. To embrace the silt meant to tether oneself to a single patch of earth, to build walls that could not be moved, and to invest one's entire future into a few acres of mud. It was the end of the age of the hunter and the beginning of the age of the steward. The spear was not discarded, but it was joined by the hoe, as the first farmers began the grueling work of turning the river's chaotic gift into a calculated harvest.
As the first seeds were pressed into that dark Mesopotamian mud, the concept of home began to change. It was no longer a temporary camp beneath the stars, but a permanent stake in the ground. By choosing to stay, these early pioneers began to observe the rivers with the intensity of a lover and the caution of an enemy. They learned the timing of the snowmelt from the distant peaks and the signs of a coming storm. They were no longer merely surviving the landscape. They were starting to dialogue with it, attempting to predict the unpredictable. To manage this new way of life, the individual was no longer enough. The silt demanded cooperation. A single family could not dig a canal or build a levee to hold back a flood, but a village could. This necessity of labor birthed the first social contracts. The rivers forced people to organize, to divide tasks, and to appoint leaders who could oversee the complex irrigation systems required to keep the crops alive during the blistering heat of the summer months. In the struggle to manage the water, the very architecture of human society began to take shape. This transition was not without its shadows. With the stationary toil of the plow came the concept of property, land that belonged to one person and not another. Where there is property, there is the potential for conflict and the need for protection. The silt that grew the grain also provided the material for the first defensive walls. The peaceful riverbanks became the sites of the first disputes over water rights and boundaries, proving that the wealth of the earth always comes with the burden of defending it. Yet, despite the heat, the floods, and the endless labor, the experiment succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The surplus of grain grown in that river mud allowed some people to stop farming altogether. For the first time, there was room for the weaver, the potter, the priest, and the scribe. The energy of the rivers was being converted into human creativity and specialized skill. The cradle of civilization was not a metaphorical title. It was a literal description of how the mud of the Tigris and Euphrates nurtured the infancy of every art and science we hold dear. Ultimately, the story of Mesopotamia is the story of how a landscape of extremes forced humanity to become extraordinary. We are the children of that ancient silt, heirs of a legacy of ingenuity born from the mud. As we look back across the millennia, we see that every skyscraper, every law code, and every library began with a single farmer standing on a riverbank, looking at the temperamental water and deciding that the promise of the mud was worth the risk of the flood. Before the first monumental stones were ever quarried for a palace, and long before the shadow of a ziggurat fell across the plains, there were the reeds. In the southernmost reaches of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates slow their frantic pace and dissolve into a shimmering labyrinth of water and silt, a unique world took root. This was a landscape of emerald and gold, a vast expanse of wetlands where the distinction between earth and water blurred into a single breathing entity. Here, the earliest pioneers of the marshlands discovered a bounty that required no plow, only an intimate understanding of the living environment that surrounded them. The lifeblood of this watery world was the kasab, a giant, versatile reed that could grow to the height of a small tree. To the early inhabitants, these reeds were not merely plants, they were the primary building blocks of existence. With a skill passed down through silent observation, they learned to harvest, dry, and weave these stalks into everything they required. They were the master architects of the organic, creating a world where almost every object of daily use, from the baskets that held their catch to the very floors beneath their feet, was a gift from the marsh. Imagine for a moment the site of a prehistoric marsh village at dawn. The homes, known as mudifs, were wonders of vernacular engineering. By bundling together massive stalks of reeds and anchoring them into the mud, the settlers created soaring, cathedral-like arches. Over these ribs, they draped intricately woven mats to form walls and roofs. These structures were not just shelters, they were living lungs designed to breathe with the humid air, providing a cool, shaded sanctuary from the blistering Mesopotamian sun, while allowing the gentle breezes of the Gulf to pass through. The geography of the marshes demanded a life of constant motion upon the water. In a world without solid roads, the canoe became the chariot of the common man. Carved from wood, or more often, fashioned from bundles of reeds coated in thick, waterproof bitumen, these sleek vessels allowed the marsh dwellers to navigate the hidden channels and secret lagoons. They moved with a ghostly silence, gliding through the tall grasses to hunt for waterfowl or to check the nets they had cast for the abundant silver fish that teemed beneath the surface. In this liquid landscape, the concept of land itself was a human creation. When the waters rose and natural high ground was scarce, the people built their own islands. By layering reeds and mud into massive floating platforms, they created stable foundations for their homes and their livestock. On these man-made islets, the lowing of water buffalo echoed across the water. These massive, gentle beasts became the companions of the marsh folk, providing milk, dung for fuel, and a source of wealth that could be counted in the heat of the noon sun. The rhythm of life in the marshes was dictated by the tides and the seasonal pulse of the great rivers. There was a profound peace in this symbiosis, a sense of belonging to a cycle that was far older than the memory of man. The people of the reeds did not seek to conquer their environment, they sought to harmonize with it. They understood the language of the wind in the grasses and the subtle shifts in the water's clarity that signaled a change in the season. Theirs was a culture of fluid boundaries, where the survival of the community depended on a collective respect for the ecosystem. This abundance of the marshes provided the crucial slack time that civilization requires to begin its ascent. Because the water provided food with relative ease, fish, birds, and edible roots, the population began to swell. The marshes acted as a biological engine, producing a surplus of life that eventually spilled over onto the dry plains. It was the stability of this reed-based economy that allowed for the first true social gatherings, the first shared myths told around communal fires, and the first specialized craftsmen who could spend their days perfecting a weave or a hull. Yet for all its beauty, the marsh was a fragile paradise. It was a world built on organic materials that would eventually rot and return to the earth, leaving little for the archaeologists of the future to find. Unlike the stone-carving empires of the north, the history of the marsh Arabs was written in the water and the wind. This lack of permanence, however, did not mean a lack of sophistication. Their mastery of sustainable living and their ability to thrive in a shifting environment was a testament to the sheer adaptability of the human spirit. These marsh dwellers were the unsung ancestors of the great urbanites of Uruk and Ur. They provided the protein and the materials that fueled the first building booms of the Bronze Age. Even as the first cities began to rise on the horizon, the marsh remained a vital hinterland, a place of refuge, a source of myth, and a reminder of a time when the world was green, wet, and wild. The Garden of Eden, described in later scriptures, likely drew its imagery from these lush, primordial wetlands where life seemed to spring directly from the union of sun and water. As we look back at the origins of Mesopotamia, we must see the marsh not as a primitive backwater, but as a sophisticated foundation. It was the place where humanity first learned the art of the constructed environment. Every arched palace of the later kings and every vaulted tomb owed its spiritual lineage to the reed Mudif. The story of Mesopotamia is a story of transition from the soft, woven world of the marshes to the hard, sun-baked world of the city. But the soul of the rivers would always belong to the reeds.
As the centuries passed, the small clusters of reed huts and riverside villages began to coalesce into something the world had never seen before, a colossal, permanent hive of human activity known as Uruk. This was the moment the horizon changed forever. No longer was the landscape defined only by the natural curves of the river or the sway of the marsh grass. Now, a massive, jagged silhouette of sun-baked mud brick rose against the sky, visible for miles across the flat plains. Uruk was not merely a larger village, it was the revolution in the human experience. It was the world's first true metropolis, a place where the intimacy of the tribe was replaced by the staggering complexity of the city. The birth of Uruk marked the end of the era of knowing everyone by name. In the village, your identity was your family. In Uruk, your identity began to be defined by your role in a massive, interlocking machine. Within its high, defensive walls, which legend says were built by the hero Gilgamesh himself, lived tens of thousands of people. This concentration of souls created a social friction that sparked a fire of innovation. For the first time, humans were living in a built environment so vast that it felt like a world unto itself, a sanctuary of order carved out of the unpredictable wilderness of the ancient Near East. At the literal and spiritual center of this urban explosion stood the Ayana district, the precinct of the goddess Inanna. Here, architecture became a form of prayer. The temples were not merely buildings, they were monumental stages for the drama of civilization. The people of Uruk decorated their massive temple walls with a technique known as cone mosaics. Thousands of small, baked clay cylinders colored red, black, and white pressed into the wet mud plaster to create vibrant, geometric patterns. These shimmering walls served as a visual testament to the city's wealth and its ability to organize the labor of thousands toward a single, glorious purpose. This concentration of power required a new kind of leader, the En, or priest king. The En was the shepherd of the city, the individual responsible for ensuring that the gods remained satisfied so that the rivers would continue to flow and the crops would continue to grow. In Uruk, the distinction between the sacred and the secular did not exist. The temple was the bank, the courthouse, the granary, and the town square. To live in Uruk was to live within a giant, sacred household, where every loaf of bread and every jug of beer was part of a cosmic ledger overseen by the divine. The scale of Uruk demanded a mastery of logistics that would baffle a simpler society. To feed a city of 50,000, the surrounding landscape had to be transformed into a highly disciplined factory of grain. A vast network of canals radiated outward from the city like the spokes of a wheel, carrying the life-giving water of the Euphrates to distant fields. This was the first hinterland, a zone of intense cultivation that existed solely to support the urban core. The city and the country became two halves of a single heart, pumping resources back and forth in a rhythmic cycle of harvest and consumption. Within the city walls, the noise must have been a constant, bewildering symphony.
Imagine the clatter of the potter's wheels, the shouting of merchants in the marketplace, and the rhythmic thud of the brickmaker's molds. This was the birth of specialization. When food is guaranteed by a centralized system, the human mind is freed to focus on a single craft. In Uruk, you could find the world's first professional bakers, weavers, metalworkers, and jewelers. The jack-of-all-trades of the nomadic era was replaced by the master of the specific, leading to an explosion in the quality and variety of human goods. But the most profound change was invisible. It was the change in how humans perceived time and space. In the city, life was no longer just about the next meal. It was about the next year, the next decade, and the memory of the ancestors. The city provided a sense of permanence. While a reed hut might rot, the great ziggurat of Uruk felt eternal. This sense of longevity gave birth to the first true histories and the first grand ambitions. The people of Uruk were no longer just surviving the world. They were attempting to build a world that would outlast them. Uruk also introduced the darker side of the urban contract, the birth of hierarchy and the loss of absolute freedom. In the city, some lived in sprawling villas while others toiled in the heat of the kilns. Taxes were invented here, not as a burden, but as a necessity to keep the massive machine running. The individual gave up a portion of their independence in exchange for the security of the walls and the reliability of the grain stores. It was a social contract written in the very dust of the streets, a bargain that has defined urban life for 5,000 years. The influence of Uruk was so great that its culture spread like a wave across the Near East. We see the Uruk expansion in the archaeological record, the city's pottery, its architectural style, and its administrative tools appearing hundreds of miles away in the mountains of Iran and the forests of Turkey. It was the world's first cultural empire, an urban revolution that exported the very idea of what it meant to be civilized. To the rest of the world, Uruk was the shining city on a hill, a beacon of what was possible when humans worked in unison. Ultimately, Uruk was the crucible where the modern human soul was forged. It was the place where we learned to live together, to work together, and to dream on a monumental scale. As we look at the ruins of Uruk today, now just mounds of earth in the Iraqi desert, we are looking at our own beginnings. Every modern city, from London to New York to Tokyo, is a descendant of those first mud brick streets. Uruk taught us that while we may be small individually, together we can build mountains.
In the bustling administrative corridors of Uruk, a crisis was quietly brewing, a crisis of memory. As the city grew into a sprawling metropolis, the human brain reached its natural limit. No single priest or overseer could remember which farmer had contributed his share of barley, how many sheep had been sent to the weavers, or how many jars of beer were owed to the laborers digging the new canals. The complexity of the first city had outpaced the capacity of the mind. To survive, civilization needed an external hard drive. It needed a way to freeze spoken words and fluid numbers into a permanent form. This necessity gave birth to the most transformative technology in human history, writing. The journey toward the written word did not begin with a stroke of literary genius, but with humble clay tokens. For centuries, Mesopotamians had used small clay shapes, cones, spheres, and discs to represent quantities of goods. A cone might represent a measure of grain, a cylinder a head of cattle. To secure a transaction, these tokens were sometimes encased in a hollow clay ball called a bulla. However, a problem arose. Once the ball was sealed, you couldn't see what was inside.
To solve this, the ancient accountants began pressing the tokens into the wet surface of the clay ball before sealing them, leaving an imprint of the contents on the outside. Eventually, a brilliant anonymous scribe realized that the tokens themselves were redundant. If you could see the mark of the token on the clay, you didn't need the physical object inside. The three-dimensional token vanished, and the two-dimensional symbol was born. The clay ball flattened into a tablet, and the marks became the first characters. These early signs were pictograms, simple, stylized drawings of the things they represented. A head of an ox meant an ox. A bow meant a ration of food. This was proto-writing, a system that functioned like a visual shopping list for the gods. But pictograms were limited. How do you draw faith? How do you draw the past tense? How do you record the specific sound of a person's name? The scribes of Mesopotamia began to push the boundaries of their clay canvas. They turned the pictures into phonetic symbols, where a sign represented a sound rather than just an object. This was the rebus principle. If you needed to write a name that sounded like water, mountain, you would combine the picture for water with the picture for mountain. This leap from the visual to the auditory allowed the scribes to capture the actual rhythm and nuance of the Sumerian language. The tools of the trade dictated the aesthetic of the script. In the marshy riverbanks, the scribes found an endless supply of reeds. By trimming the end of a reed into a triangular nib, they created a stylus. When pressed into the soft, moist clay of a tablet, this stylus left a distinct wedge-shaped impression. This is why we call the script cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. It was a tactile, three-dimensional form of writing. A tablet was not just read, it was felt. The wedge-shaped strokes were arranged in complex patterns that required years of rigorous training to master in the eduba, or tablet house. For the first few centuries, cuneiform remained a tool of the bureaucracy, a cold, efficient method of tracking taxes, debts, and inventories. It was the language of the accountant, not the poet. However, once the genie of literacy was out of the bottle, it could not be contained. Scribes began to realize that if they could record the number of sheep in a field, they could also record the laws of the king. They could record the movements of the stars, the recipes for medicine, and the ancient myths that had previously only existed as spoken stories told around a fire. Writing changed the very nature of human power. It created a clerical class, a group of elite individuals who held the keys to information. In a world where most people could not read, the scribe was a magician who could make the dead speak and the distant present. A king's command no longer traveled only as far as his voice could carry. It could be written down, stamped with a seal, and carried to the furthest reaches of the land, maintaining its authority with every mile. Writing turned a collection of people into a state, and a state into an empire. Perhaps most importantly, writing changed the human relationship with time. Before the tablet, the past was a shifting, blurry thing, subject to the whims of memory and the embellishments of storytellers. With cuneiform, the past became fixed. A contract signed 3 generations ago could be pulled from a shelf and held up as proof in a court of law. For the first time, humans were no longer trapped in the now. They could speak to people they would never meet and leave instructions for a future they would never see. The clay itself was a stroke of luck for history. Unlike the papyrus of Egypt or the parchment of later Europe, which rot or burn, a clay tablet is nearly indestructible once it is baked, either in a kiln or in the accidental fires of a city being sacked. When a Mesopotamian library burned, the books didn't disappear. They were fired into stone, preserved for thousands of years beneath the sand. We have hundreds of thousands of these tablets today, ranging from grand royal decrees to schoolboys' messy homework and intimate letters between husbands and wives. As we look at a cuneiform tablet today, we are looking at the birth of the extended mind. We are seeing the moment humanity stepped outside of its biological limits and began to store its soul in the earth. Every email, every book, and every line of code we write today is a direct descendant of those first wedge-shaped marks in the mud of Uruk. The scribes didn't just invent a way to track grain, they invented a way for the human race to remember itself forever.
High above the flat, dusty horizon of the Mesopotamian plain, a shimmering beacon of light announced the presence of the divine. This was the White Temple of Uruk, a structure so profound in its conception that it redefined the relationship between man and the cosmos. In a land devoid of natural stone or towering mountains, the people of Mesopotamia were forced to become the architects of their own sacred peaks. They hauled millions of sun-baked mud bricks, basket by basket, to raise a massive sloping platform known as a ziggurat. Atop this man-made mountain sat the temple itself, its walls coated in a brilliant white gypsum plaster that caught the desert sun and reflected it back with a blinding celestial intensity. The White Temple was more than a mere building. It was a psychological threshold. To approach it, a citizen of Uruk had to physically leave the level ground of the common world and ascend a series of steep, winding staircases. This ascent was a ritual in itself, a slow, deliberate movement away from the noise and filth of the crowded streets toward the rarefied air of the heavens. By the time a priest reached the summit, he stood on a literal bridge between the terrestrial and the celestial. This was the ziggurat, the high place, the anchored point where the gods were believed to descend from the stars to walk among their people. The architectural design of the White Temple reflected a deep-seated need for order and hierarchy. Unlike the open plazas of later civilizations, the interior of the White Temple was a place of deep mystery and restricted access. It was a longhouse design with a central sanctuary flanked by smaller rooms. At one end stood the altar where offerings were placed, rich meats, fresh fruits, and libations of beer and wine to satisfy the appetites of the gods. Only the En, the priest-king, and his inner circle were permitted to enter these hallowed chambers. To the average citizen watching from below, the temple was a silent powerhouse, a cosmic engine whose inner workings were known only to the elite. In the eyes of the Sumerians, the god did not merely visit the temple, the god lived there. The temple was the the house of the deity. In the case of the White Temple, it was likely dedicated to Anu, the god of the sky and the father of all deities. Because the god was the true owner of the city, the temple functioned as the headquarters of the entire state. The massive platforms beneath the temple were filled with storehouses and administrative offices. The spiritual health of the city was inseparable from its economic health. If the temple was full of grain and the walls were bright with plaster, it was a sign that the covenant between the city and the sky remained unbroken. The construction of such a monument was a feat of staggering collective willpower. Without the aid of wheels, pulleys, or iron tools, the people of Uruk transformed the very earth beneath their feet into a monument of permanence. Every brick was a testament to the city's ability to organize its labor force.
The White Temple proved that a city was not just a collection of houses, but a shared vision. The sheer labor required to maintain the temple, replastering the white walls after every rainy season, repairing the brickwork, and managing the vast estates attached to it, kept the community bound together in a perpetual cycle of service and devotion. The White Temple also served as the world's first true laboratory of time and space. From the high terraces of the Ziggurat, the priests had an unobstructed view of the horizon. They watched the rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the subtle dance of the planets. They realized that the movements of the heavens were predictable, following a divine rhythm that could be mapped and measured. The temple was an observatory where the first calendars were born, allowing the city to synchronize its planting, harvesting, and festivals with the celestial clockwork of the gods. Life in the shadow of the White Temple was lived in a state of perpetual verticality. The height of the structure acted as a constant reminder of the social and spiritual ladder. The king stood at the top, the priests just below, and the craftsmen, farmers, and laborers formed the broad base of the pyramid. This hierarchy was seen as a reflection of the divine order of the universe. Just as the stars had their fixed paths, humans had their fixed roles. The stability of the city depended on everyone knowing their place in the grand architecture of society, a concept that was physically manifested in the very shape of the ziggurat. Despite its grandeur, the White Temple was a fragile triumph. Built of mud and straw, it was in a constant state of slow dissolution, threatened by the wind, the occasional rain, and the passage of time. This required the people to constantly renew their sacred spaces, often building new temples directly on top of the ruins of the old. Over centuries, these layers of history rose higher and higher, creating the tells or mounds that dot the landscape of modern Iraq today. The history of Mesopotamia is a history of layers, a story of people constantly building on the foundations of their ancestors to reach ever closer to the light. As we look back at the White Temple, we see the birth of the monumental mind. It was the moment humanity stopped living only for the present and began to build for the eternal. The temple was a declaration that the human spirit was not content to remain in the dust. It wanted to climb. The white walls of Uruk were a message sent across the millennia, asserting that even in a world made of mud, we can create something radiant. It was the first skyscraper, the first cathedral, and the first true center of the world.
As the walls of Uruk grew higher and its temples brighter, the people of the plains began to realize a sobering truth. Their fertile mud could grow enough grain to feed an army, but it could not produce a single ounce of gold, a block of lapis lazuli, or a sturdy cedar beam. To build the monuments their gods deserved, the Sumerians had to look beyond their horizon toward the rugged, mysterious highlands that ringed their world. This necessity birthed the first epic of international diplomacy and competition, the legend of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. This story, recorded on clay tablets centuries later, provides a fascinating glimpse into how the first city dwellers perceived the others who lived in the wild spaces beyond the river's edge. According to the myth, Enmerkar, the builder king of Uruk, desired to adorn the temple of Inanna with precious metals and stones that could only be found in the distant, fabled land of Aratta, a kingdom hidden deep within the mountains of modern-day Iran. However, Aratta was not a vassal to be easily conquered. It was a peer to be outmaneuvered.
And Merkar did not send an army, he sent a messenger. This lone traveler became the world's first diplomat, crossing the 7 mountain ranges to deliver a series of riddles and demands. The story unfolds as a battle of wits, a cosmic game of chess played with words and symbols across hundreds of miles of treacherous terrain. This legend is famously credited with a second invention of writing. As the challenges between the two kings grew more complex, the messenger became overwhelmed, his memory unable to hold the long, intricate messages he was tasked to carry. To solve this, Enmerkar allegedly took a piece of clay and smoothed it with his hands, scratching his words upon it so the clay could speak for him. When the Lord of Aratta received the tablet, he stood in stunned silence. He was looking at the first letter in history. The story captures the profound psychological shock of literacy, the moment when a physical object could carry a human voice across a mountain range. Beyond the magic of writing, the tale of Aratta reveals the fundamental tension of the ancient world, the relationship between the civilized valley and the barbarian hills. The Sumerians viewed themselves as the center of the universe, the people of order and law, while they viewed the mountain dwellers as rugged, wealthy, yet spiritually unrefined. And yet, they were utterly dependent on one another. The grain of the south was traded for the stone of the north. This was the birth of the long-distance trade networks that would eventually stretch from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley, turning Mesopotamia into the beating heart of a global economy. The Lord of Aratta represents the eternal rival, the neighbor who has what you need but refuses to give it up without a fight or a bargain. The riddles exchanged between the two kings, involving nets of grain and scepters of magical wood, were metaphors for technological and cultural superiority. To win the diplomatic battle was to prove that your god was more powerful and your city more favored by destiny. It shows us that even at the dawn of history, power was not just measured in spears, but in the ability to command resources and outthink an opponent. This chapter of the Mesopotamian story also touches on the confusion of tongues. In the epic, Enmerkar prays for a time when all the peoples of the world, the lands of Shubur, Hamazi, Sumer, and Akkad, will speak to the god Enlil in a single language. It reflects a deep-seated human memory of a time before the world was fractured by different dialects and borders. In the bustling markets of Uruk, where traders from a dozen different tribes converged, the Sumerians were acutely aware of the barriers created by language, and they dreamed of a unity that trade and writing might one day restore. The journey of the messenger between Uruk and Aratta also highlights the sheer physical bravery required by the first explorers. To leave the safety of the city walls and venture into the highlands was to enter a realm of monsters, bandits, and unpredictable spirits. The messenger is a recurring hero in Sumerian literature, the tireless bridge between worlds, whose feet wore down the paths that would later become the great Silk Roads of antiquity. Through his eyes, we see the vastness of the ancient world, a place where a single city was a tiny island of light in a sea of unknown wilderness. Ultimately, the Lord of Aratta eventually yields, not to the sword, but to the overwhelming prestige of Uruk. The story concludes with a massive caravan of mountain treasures descending into the plains to adorn the temples of Sumer. It was a victory for the urban model. It proved that a city with a centralized government and a written language could project its influence far beyond its own walls, bending distant lands to its will through the sheer gravity of its wealth and culture. The legend of Enmerkar reminds us that the first cities were never isolated. They were participants in a grand, often tense dialogue with the wider world. The land between the rivers was a crossroads, a place where the ideas of the mountains met the resources of the sea. The desire for more gold, more beauty, more prestige, pushed the Mesopotamians to explore, to negotiate, and to document. It was this restless, outward-looking energy that ensured their culture would not just survive in the mud, but would spread its seeds to the very ends of the earth. As we conclude this chapter, we see a world that has become interconnected. The messenger has returned, the tablet has been read, and the gold of Arata now glitters in the temples of Uruk. The stage is set for the rise of dynasties, for the glitter of royal burials, and for the inevitable conflicts that arise when many cities begin to vie for the same piece of the horizon.
If Uruk was the city of the first light, then was the city of the golden shadow. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the focus of power had shifted south to a thriving port city where the Euphrates met the sea. In the 1920s, the world was stunned by the discovery of the Great Death Pit within Ur's royal cemetery, a discovery that remains one of the most breathtaking and haunting glimpses into the ancient world. Here, the Mesopotamian elite did not simply pass away, they staged their departure with a theatricality that bordered on the divine. Beneath the sand lay vaults of limestone and mud brick, filled with a staggering hoard of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli that proved the Sumerians had successfully traded their surplus grain for the treasures of the known world. The most famous inhabitant of this city of the dead was a woman named Puabi, identified by a cylinder seal as a nin or queen. Her body was found adorned in a magnificent headdress of gold leaves, carnelian beads, and delicate willow leaves of beaten gold. She was draped in a cloak of beads made from semi-precious stones, a shimmering carapace that marked her even in death as someone who stood apart from the rest of humanity. But it was not the gold that chilled the hearts of the excavators, it was the company she kept. In the pits surrounding the royal chambers lay the remains of dozens of people, soldiers with their bronze helmets, musicians with their silver harps, and handmaidens in their finest jewelry, all arranged in orderly rows. This was the great sacrifice, a chilling testament to the absolute power of the Sumerian monarchs. These attendants had not been slaughtered in a chaotic frenzy. Evidence suggests they walked into the tomb under their own power, took a ritual drink, perhaps laced with a sedative or poison, and lay down to sleep forever alongside their sovereign. To the Sumerian mind, the afterlife was a bleak, dusty realm, and a queen could not be expected to navigate its shadows without her court. This ritual was the ultimate expression of a hierarchy so rigid that it extended beyond a grave, suggesting that the social contract of the city had evolved into a religious devotion that demanded the ultimate price. The artifacts found within these tombs, such as the famous Standard of act as a silent documentary of the age. This hollow wooden box, decorated with intricate mosaics of shell and lapis lazuli, depicts two distinct sides of Sumerian life, war and peace. On the war side, we see the first depictions of four-wheeled chariots trampling enemies and soldiers in cloaks leading captives toward the king. On the peace side, we see a grand banquet with musicians playing lyres and servants bringing goats and fish for a royal feast.
These images tell us that by the time of Ur's greatness, the city was no longer just a temple state. It was a military power with a professional class of warriors and a sophisticated courtly life. The wealth of the tombs reveals the incredible reach of the Sumerian trade networks. The gold came from the mountains of Anatolia or Egypt. The lapis lazuli traveled thousands of miles from the mines of Afghanistan. The carnelian arrived from the Indus Valley. Ur was the terminal of a globalized world, a place where the riches of the earth were concentrated in a few square miles of river mud. The craftsmen who worked these materials were masters of their art, capable of creating the ram in a thicket, a delicate sculpture of gold, shell, and lapis lazuli that remains a masterpiece of balance and color 5,000 years later. However, the royal tombs also mark a shift in the Mesopotamian psyche. The humble, community-focused spirit of the early marsh villages had been replaced by a cult of personality. The king was no longer just a shepherd, he was a terrifying figure of cosmic importance. This era, known as the early dynastic period, was a time of fierce competition between city-states like Ur, Kish, and Lagash. Every city wanted to be the most beautiful and the most feared, leading to an arms race of architecture and jewelry that culminated in these extravagant burials. The music of the tombs provides a haunting soundtrack to this history. Several magnificent lyres and harps were found in the death pits, their wooden frames long since rotted away, but their shapes preserved by the gold and silver that once adorned them. One particularly famous lyre features the head of a bearded bull, a symbol of divine power and fertility. Archaeologists found the skeletons of the musicians with their hands still resting near the strings, suggesting they played until the very moment the poison took hold. It is a reminder that the Sumerian world was one of profound beauty and profound cruelty, inextricably linked. Why did this practice of human sacrifice eventually stop? As the centuries progressed, the Mesopotamians seemed to move toward a more symbolic view of the afterlife. Later kings would be buried with statues or clay figures to serve them, rather than living people. Perhaps the social cost of losing an entire court with each royal death became too high, or perhaps the religious imagination of the people evolved. Regardless, the royal tombs of Ur remain a unique, frozen moment in time, a snapshot of a civilization at the absolute peak of its early confidence and its most extreme expression of devotion. Today, the gold of Queen Puabi sits in museums under the gaze of millions who live in a world she could never have imagined. But the questions raised by her tomb remain. What kind of faith leads a person to follow their queen into the dark? What kind of society can command such total loyalty? The royal tombs of Ur are a mirror held up to the human soul, reflecting our capacity for incredible art, staggering organization, and the terrifying lengths we will go to ensure we are never forgotten. As the sun sets over the ruins of Ur, the golden headdresses and silver harps remind us that the Mesopotamians were the first to grapple with the great below. They were the first to try and bribe the gods of death with the treasures of the earth, and while their gold survived, their empire did not. The stage was now set for a new kind of conflict, not just between cities and death, but between cities and each other, as the first great wars of history began to brew over the fertile soil of the riverbanks.
While the kings and queens of Ur were being laid to rest in gold, the peace of the southern plains was being shattered by a much harsher reality: the struggle for land and water. By 2450 BCE, the Mesopotamian city-states had grown so large that their borders began to touch.
creating friction that could no longer be resolved through diplomacy. The most famous of these conflicts was a generations-long blood feud between the neighboring cities of Lagash and Umma. The prize was a fertile strip of territory known as the Gu-Idin, the edge of the plain. This was the site of the first recorded war in human history, an event immortalized on a jagged fragment of limestone known as the vulture stele. The vulture stele is a masterpiece of early propaganda and a grim window into the birth of organized warfare. On one side, it depicts King Eonatum of Lagash leading his troops into battle. This is not a chaotic skirmish of individuals. It is the birth of the phalanx. The soldiers are shown as a disciplined, impenetrable wall of bronze shields and leveled spears, marching in perfect unison over the broken bodies of their enemies. Eonatum himself stands at the front, a giant among men, his figure suggesting that the king was the personification of the state's collective will. The imagery is clear. Victory belongs to those who are organized, disciplined, and favored by the gods. The stele earns its name from a chilling scene at the top. A flock of vultures circles the battlefield, clutching the severed heads and limbs of the defeated soldiers of Umma in their talons. This was the Mesopotamian version of psychological warfare. It was a message to any who would dare challenge the borders of Lagash. Your bodies will not be given a sacred burial. You will be left to the birds of the air. This marked a shift in the nature of conflict. War was no longer just about territory. It was about the total humiliation and destruction of the opponent's dignity. On the reverse side of the stele, the victory is given a divine mandate. It shows the god Ningirsu, the patron of Lagash, holding a giant net filled with the cowering captive soldiers of Umma. This imagery reinforced the Mesopotamian belief that earthly wars were merely reflections of celestial ones. Eonatum did not fight for himself. He fought as the vicar of Ningirsu. To challenge Lagash was to challenge the god himself. This fusion of military might and religious zeal provided a powerful justification for the expansion of city borders and the subjugation of neighboring peoples. The vulture stele also records the first formal peace treaty in history. After the slaughter, a boundary stone was erected, and the defeated king of Umma was forced to swear a series of solemn oaths by the great gods of Sumer. He promised never to trespass on the Gu-Idin again, under the threat of divine wrath. Of course, history tells us that treaties written in mud and blood are rarely permanent. The war between Lagash and Umma would flare up again and again for another century. It established a cycle of revenge that would eventually weaken the Sumerian city-states, leaving them vulnerable to outside conquest. Technologically, this era saw the first arms race. The vulture stele shows soldiers wearing heavy copper helmets and what appears to be armored cloaks reinforced with metal studs, the world's first flat jackets. The emergence of the professional soldier meant that a portion of the city's population was now dedicated solely to the art of killing. This required a massive administrative effort to feed, clothe, and arm these men, further centralizing the power of the palace. The city was no longer just a place of prayer and trade, it was a fortress. The conflict over the Gu-Idin also highlights the environmental stakes of the ancient world. In a land where the desert is always encroaching, a single canal or a fertile field is the difference between prosperity and starvation. The war between Lagash and Umma was essentially a water war. By diverting a canal or damming a stream, one city could choke the life out of another without ever scaling its walls. This vulnerability forced cities to project their power further and further from their centers, leading to the creation of the first territorial states. As we study the fractured limestone of the vulture stele today, we are looking at the birth of a tragic human pattern. The same ingenuity that allowed the Sumerians to build the first cities and invent writing was now being turned toward the systematic destruction of their fellow men. The phalanx, the siege, and the treaty were all born here in the dust between Lagash and Umma. The age of pioneers had truly ended, replaced by an age of iron-willed kings who measured their greatness by the number of enemies beneath their chariots. The vulture stele reminds us that civilization has always been a fragile thing, built on the edge of a sword. The same organization that allowed Uruk to flourish now allowed Lagash to conquer. But as the city-states exhausted themselves in these endless border wars, they were failing to notice a new shadow growing in the north. A new kind of leader was emerging, one who didn't just want to win a strip of land, but who wanted to rule the entire world.
While the kings of Sumer were busy drawing borders with the edge of a sword, one woman was redrawing the map of the human spirit. Her name was Enheduanna, and she holds a title that no conqueror can claim. She is the world's first named author. In an age where almost all writing was anonymous, the work of nameless temple bureaucrats, Enheduanna signed her name to her work, stepping out of the shadows of prehistory and into the light of literature. As the daughter of Sargon the Great, the man who would forge the world's first empire, she was appointed as the high priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of Ur. Her mission was profoundly political, but her legacy was deeply personal. Enheduanna's primary task was to serve as the cultural glue for her father's new empire. Sargon had conquered the Sumerian south, but the people there were proud and rebellious, weary of their new Akkadian masters. To bridge the divide, Enheduanna utilized her position to weave together the religious traditions of both peoples. She took the Akkadian goddess Ishtar and the Sumerian goddess Inanna and fused them into a single supreme celestial power. Through her series of temple hymns, she synchronized the local gods of 42 different cities into one unified pantheon. This was the birth of ideological branding, using the power of the written word to create a shared identity across a fractured landscape. However, Enheduanna was far more than a political puppet. Her most famous work, The Exaltation of Inanna, is a raw and sophisticated masterpiece that chronicles a period of personal and political crisis. During a rebellion in Ur, she was driven from her temple and stripped of her royal office. In her poetry, she describes the agony of exile, the biting cold of her situation, and her desperate plea to the goddess for restoration. This was a revolutionary shift in writing. For the first time, the I appears on the clay tablet. She wasn't just recording myths, she was recording her own internal emotional state, the first person in history to use writing as a tool for self-expression and catharsis. The language of her hymns is strikingly vivid and visceral. She describes Inanna as a great storm and a roaring lion, a goddess who could turn light into darkness and men into women. Unlike the dry, list-like accounts of the early scribes, Enheduanna's work has a rhythmic, haunting beauty. She describes the physical act of writing itself as giving birth, a metaphor that captures the labor and the creation of something entirely new. To read her words today is to hear a voice that sounds startlingly modern, a voice that is angry, vulnerable, and ultimately triumphant when she is finally restored to her temple.
Her influence was so immense that her poems were copied and studied in the Eduba, tablet houses, for hundreds of years after her death. She became the gold standard for Mesopotamian literature. Every aspiring scribe had to learn her style, ensuring that her voice echoed through the halls of Babylonian and Assyrian power for nearly 2 millennia. By placing her name on the tablet, she broke the barrier of anonymity, asserting that a single human mind could be the source of wisdom and beauty worthy of being remembered. Enheduanna's life also tells us much about the status of royal women in ancient Mesopotamia. As the high priestess, she wasn't just a religious figure. She was a powerful administrator who managed the vast estates of the Temple of Ur. She was the representative of the king in the south, a diplomat who navigated the dangerous waters of local politics. Her existence reminds us that the cradle of civilization was not built by men alone. Women of her stature were patrons of the arts, leaders of industry, and, as she proved, the very architects of the literary world. As we look at the disc of Enheduanna, a limestone relief showing her dressed in a tiered robe, leading a ritual, we see a woman of immense poise and authority. She stands as a bridge between 2 eras, the age of the independent Sumerian city-state and the new age of the Akkadian Empire. Through her, we see that the pen could be as effective as the phalanx. While her father's empire would eventually crumble to dust, her words were fired into the clay, outlasting the walls of Akkad and the chariots of Ur. Ultimately, Enheduanna taught humanity that our thoughts have value beyond the moment they are spoken. She transformed writing from a system of accounting into a system of feeling. She gave us the first glimpse into the human heart struggling with power, loss, and the divine. She is the ancestor of every poet, every novelist, and every person who has ever picked up a pen to try and make sense of their world. The age of the city-states was ending, and the age of the empire had truly arrived. But as we transition into the story of her father, Sargon, we must remember that his conquests were recorded and justified by the daughter who proved that the wedge-shaped marks of a stylus could conquer time itself.
Before the shadows of the Akkadian Empire could stretch across the horizon, there was one final, desperate attempt to save the old world of the Sumerians. It came in the form of a man named Lugal-Zaggisi, the king of Umma, the very city that had suffered so many humiliations at the hands of Lagash. Lugal-Zaggisi was a man of cold ambition and a sweeping vision that reached far beyond the narrow irrigation canals of his home. He did not merely want to win a border war. He wanted to end the era of the city-state entirely. He dreamed of a unified Sumer, a single nation governed by a single will, stretching from the lower sea of the Persian Gulf to the upper sea of the Mediterranean. Lugal-Zaggisi's rise to power was a whirlwind of conquest. He began by settling the old score with Lagash, burning its temples and ending the dynasty of Akhenaten in a fire of vengeance. From there, his momentum became unstoppable. He conquered Uruk, Ur, and Kish, eventually claiming the title of King of the Land. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed his dream had been realized. On the vases he dedicated to the temples, he boasted that the gods had made the paths straight for him from the sunrise to the sunset, and that all the lands lay in peace under his feet. It was the first time a single man had claimed to rule the entire Mesopotamian world. Yet Lugal-Zaggisi's dream was built on a fragile foundation. He represented the old guard,
a king who still believed in the traditional Sumerian ways of decentralized temple governance, even as he tried to force them into a new, unified shape. His empire was less a state and more a collection of conquered cities held together by the threat of his army. He lacked the administrative tools to truly integrate these proud, independent centers. While he styled himself as a supreme ruler, he remained a Sumerian at heart, a man trying to manage a brand new world using the blueprints of the past. The tragedy of Lugal-Zaggisi lies in his timing. While he was celebrating his triumph in Uruk, a young man was rising in the court of Kish who would not just conquer Sumer, but dismantle it. This was Sargon, the future king of Akkad. Lugal-Zaggisi's dream of a unified Sumerian state was essentially a dress rehearsal for Sargon's much more permanent Akkadian empire. Lugal-Zaggisi had done the hard work of breaking the power of the independent cities. He had cleared the board, but he was not the one destined to win the game. The final confrontation between Lugal-Zaggisi and Sargon is one of the most dramatic turning points in human history. The old Sumerian phalanx, which had dominated the battlefield since the vulture steel, met the new, more mobile Akkadian forces. Lugal-Zaggisi was defeated, and in a moment of ultimate humiliation, he was placed in a neck yoke and led through the Enlil Gate in the holy city of Nippur. This was more than the defeat of a king. It was the symbolic death of the Sumerian city-state era. The gods, it seemed, had withdrawn their favor from the ancient houses of the south and given it to the newcomers of the north. Despite his defeat, Lugal-Zaggisi's legacy is profound. He was the first to prove that the unification of the world was a possible, even a desirable goal. He shifted the human imagination away from the city wall and toward the imperial border. He proved that the petty squabbles between Lagash and Umma were small compared to the potential of a united Mesopotamia. Even though he died in a cage, his vision of a single king ruling from sea to sea became the standard by which every future Mesopotamian ruler would measure their success. Lugal-Zaggisi's reign was the sunset of the Sumerian people as a political power. After him, the Sumerian language would slowly begin its long decline into a tongue used only by priests and scholars, replaced in the streets by the Akkadian of the conquerors. His dream was a beautiful final flourish, a Sumerian summer before the autumn of empire began. He was a man who saw the future, but was too deeply rooted in the past to survive it. As we look back at the shattered vases of Lugal-Zaggisi, we see a cautionary tale about the transition of power. He was the bridge between the world of Gilgamesh and the world of Sargon. He showed that civilization was ready for something bigger, something more expansive, and something more terrifying. The age of the independent first cities was over. The stage was now cleared for Sargon the Great, a man who would not just wear a crown, but would become a god.
The story of Sargon of Akkad is where history and myth become inseparable, forming the foundational legend of the great king. Long before the tales of Moses or Romulus, Sargon's origin story echoed through the mud-brick corridors of Mesopotamia. Legend tells of a mother, a priestess, who bore him in secret and set him adrift in a basket of reeds on the Euphrates. Rescued by a gardener and eventually rising to become the cupbearer to the king of Kish, Sargon's journey from foundling to sovereign was seen as a sign of divine selection. He did not inherit a throne, he seized the world by the throat.
ending the era of the aristocratic Sumerian dynasties and replacing it with a new, raw form of power based on merit, charisma, and military genius. Sargon was not interested in merely winning another border war. He was the architect of the world's first true multi-ethnic empire. After defeating Lugal-Zaggisi and leading him in a neck yoke, Sargon systematically dismantled the walls of the southern cities. He realized that as long as the cities had walls, they had the means to rebel. By tearing them down, he turned Mesopotamia into an open plain under his singular command. He established a new capital, Agade, a city so legendary that its exact location remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. From this central hub, he projected power in every direction, claiming to rule from the lower sea of the Persian Gulf to the upper sea of the Mediterranean. To maintain this vast territory, Sargon invented the machinery of empire. He replaced local city-state governors with his own sons of Akkad, loyal officials who owed their status entirely to him. He standardized weights and measures across the land, ensuring that a merchant in the north and a farmer in the south were playing by the same rules. This sparked an economic explosion. For the first time, trade could flow unimpeded by local tolls and petty rivalries. Sargon didn't just conquer people, he integrated them into a massive, functioning organism that served the glory of Akkad. The Akkadian army was the engine of this new world order. Unlike the slow-moving Sumerian phalanxes of the past, Sargon's forces were built for speed and adaptability. He utilized light infantry armed with composite bows, a terrifying new technology that could rain death from a distance, and specialized units that could fight in the mountains as well as the plains. Sargon boasted that 5,400 men ate bread daily before him, signifying the birth of a standing army. This was a professional force whose only loyalty was to the emperor, giving him a level of control that no Sumerian shepherd king had ever dreamed of. Sargon's reign also saw the triumph of the Akkadian language. While Sumerian remained the language of the temples and the ancient past, Akkadian, a Semitic tongue, became the language of the court, the law, and the marketplace. This linguistic shift mirrored the political one. The old Sumerian traditions were being absorbed into a more aggressive, expansive culture. Sargon styled himself as the king of the four quarters of the world, a title that asserted his dominion over all of humanity, regardless of their tribe or tongue. Perhaps his most brilliant move was the appointment of his daughter, Eniduanna, as high priestess in the south. While Sargon held the sword in the north, his daughter held the stylus in the south, using her poetry to fuse the gods of the conquerors with the gods of the conquered. This was a masterclass in soft power. By making the gods of Akkad and Sumer one and the same, Sargon made rebellion against him feel like rebellion against the divine order of the universe itself. Sargon ruled for 56 years, a staggering length of time that allowed his new system to take deep root. He became the archetype of the conqueror king, the man who had no rival or equal. His life became the template for every ambitious ruler who followed, from Hammurabi to Alexander the Great. He proved that the boundaries of the human experience were not limited by the horizon of one's own city, but only by the reach of one's ambition and the sharpness of one's bronze. Yet Sargon's empire was a fragile thing, held together by the sheer force of his personality. As he grew old, the cities he had humiliated began to stir with the memory of their former independence. The very sons of Akkad he had placed in power found themselves surrounded by hostile populations. Sargon had created a world of unprecedented wealth and unity, but he had also created a world of resentment. The Akkadian storm had changed the map forever, but the question remained, could the empire survive the man who created it? As we look back at the legacy of Sargon, we see the birth of the imperial idea. He taught humanity that one man could rule millions and that a single law could govern a continent. He was the first to grasp the four quarters of the world, and in doing so, he set the human race on a path towards larger and larger political structures. The era of the city-state was dead. The era of the superpower had begun.
The Akkadian Empire reached its zenith under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin. If Sargon was the architect of the empire, Naram-Sin was its living god. He was the first Mesopotamian monarch to place the horned crown, the symbol of divinity, upon his own head, styling himself as the god of Akkad. His reign was one of breathtaking military success, immortalized in the famous victory stele, where he is seen ascending a mountain, trampling his enemies beneath his feet as he reaches toward the sun. But in the ancient Near East, such hubris was believed to carry a heavy price. The higher a king climbed toward heaven, the further he had to fall. According to later Mesopotamian chronicles, Naram-Sin committed a fatal act of sacrilege. Frustrated by a lack of divine oracles, he allegedly led his army into the holy city of Nippur and demolished the Ekur, the ancient and sacred temple of Enlil, the king of the gods. To the people of Sumer and Akkad, this was not just a political act, it was a tearing of the cosmic fabric. The curse of Akkad tells of how the gods, in their fury, withdrew their protection from the city of Agade. They summoned the Gutians, a mountain people who knew no inhibitions, to descend like a swarm of locusts from the Zagros mountains to avenge the broken temple. The reality of the Akkadian collapse was likely a complex tapestry of disasters. While the Gutian invasions were the visible hammer blow, the empire was already fraying from within. Recent climate data suggests that a catastrophic, centuries-long drought struck the region, turning the fertile northern plains into a dust bowl. Without the grain of the north, the imperial machine ground to a halt. Trade routes were severed, and the sons of Akkad, who governed the distant cities, found themselves isolated and under siege. The world's first superpower was discovered to be hollow, unable to feed its people or defend its borders against the pressure of a changing world. The fall of Agade was so total and so violent that the city itself vanished from the face of the earth. To this day, its location remains hidden beneath the silt, a ghost city that exists only in poems and laments. The transition was agonizing. The central administration vanished, and Mesopotamia fractured back into a patchwork of local strongmen and hungry refugees. The scribes wrote of this time with a sense of shell-shocked horror. Who was king? Who was not king? The curse of Akkad became the ultimate cautionary tale for all future rulers, a reminder that even an empire that touches the four corners of the world can be undone by the drought of the earth and the arrogance of the heart. However, the memory of Akkad did not die with its walls. Even as the Gutians occupied the land, the Akkadian language and the imperial idea remained the standard of greatness. The period of chaos that followed was a dark age, but it was also a period of gestation. The people of the south, the Sumerians, began to look back at their own ancient traditions with a new sense of nostalgia and purpose. They realized that if they wanted to survive the barbarian occupation, they would have to find a way to reclaim the strength of Sargon without the hubris of Naram-Sin.
The curse of Akkad taught the Mesopotamians a fundamental truth about the nature of power. It is a gift from the gods that can be rescinded at any moment. This belief created a more somber, reflective culture. The kings who would eventually rise to replace the Akkadians were more careful to present themselves as shepherds and servants of the divine, rather than gods themselves. The shadow of Naram Sin's horned crown loomed large, a warning that the pursuit of absolute power often leads to absolute ruin. As we look at the shattered ruins left by this era, we see the first great reset of human history. The Akkadian experiment had proved that empire was possible, but the Akkadian collapse proved that it was not inevitable. The land between the rivers lay wounded and divided, waiting for a new hero to lead it out of the darkness. And in the ancient city of a new dynasty was already beginning to stir, preparing for a final glorious revival of the Sumerian spirit.
After the long, dark night of Gutian occupation and the dusty collapse of Akkad, the sun rose one final time on the Sumerian people. This era, known as the Third Dynasty of or the Sumerian Renaissance, was a period of deliberate, meticulously planned restoration. It was led by a visionary king named Namu. Unlike the warlike Akkadians who sought to conquer the world, Namu sought to fix it. He presented himself not as a god-king, but as a righteous shepherd. His mission was to rebuild the shattered infrastructure of the south, to clear the weed-choked canals, and to restore the ancient temples to their former glory. Under his steady hand, the city of became the center of a bureaucratic golden age that was perhaps the most organized society the world had yet seen. The most enduring monument to this revival is the great Ziggurat of While earlier temples had been modest, Namu's ziggurat was a mountain of precision-engineered brickwork. Its massive core of sun-dried mud bricks was encased in a thick skin of fired bricks set in bitumen, a natural asphalt that made the structure nearly waterproof. This wasn't just a place of worship, it was a symbol of stability and a triumph of engineering that still stands in the Iraqi desert today. It sent a message to the world. Sumer was back, and its foundations were stronger than ever. However, Namu's greatest legacy was not made of brick, but of law. Long before the famous Code of Hammurabi, Namu, or perhaps his son Shulgi, commissioned the oldest known law code in human history. Written on clay in the Sumerian language, these laws established a system of justice based on compensation rather than purely physical retaliation. If a man caused a fracture of a limb, he was fined in silver. This reflected a highly sophisticated society that valued economic order and the rule of law over the eye for an eye mentality of later ages. It was a civilizing force that aimed to protect the orphan from the rich and the widow from the powerful. The administration of the Neo-Sumerian Empire was a marvel of record-keeping. The scribes of this era were obsessive. We have recovered tens of thousands of tablets from this period that track everything from the exact weight of wool distributed to weavers to the specific amount of beer provided to a messenger on a 3-day journey. This was a planned economy on a massive scale. Every bushel of grain was accounted for, and every hour of labor was recorded. While it may seem cold and bureaucratic to us, this level of organization allowed to support a massive population and fund a cultural explosion of poetry, music, and mathematics. This was also the era when the Sumerian language reached its highest literary peak,
even as it was beginning to die out as a spoken tongue. It became the language of the elite, the liturgy, and the university. The kings of founded the Eduba, the tablet house, where scholars preserved the ancient myths of Gilgamesh and the hymns of Enheduanna. They were the world's first true classicists, looking back at their own history with reverence and ensuring that the wisdom of the past was copied and recopied for future generations. Under Urnamu's son Shulgi, the empire reached its territorial peak. Shulgi was a polymath who claimed to be able to run long distances, speak multiple languages, and play every musical instrument. He expanded the borders, but he also built rest houses for travelers and established a standardized postal system. It was a time of unprecedented safety and commerce, where a traveler could supposedly walk across the empire with a bag of gold and remain unmolested. However, for all its organization, the Sumerian Renaissance was a fragile masterpiece. The very bureaucracy that made it strong also made it rigid. When the climate shifted once again and the Amorite nomads began to press against the borders from the west, the centralized system struggled to adapt. The Wall of the Land, a massive defensive fortification built to keep the nomads out, eventually failed. The cities began to bicker over resources, and the central authority of began to fray. In the end, the Sumerian Renaissance was the Indian summer of a great civilization. It was a final, brilliant flash of Sumerian genius before the language and the people were finally absorbed into the rising tide of the Semitic-speaking world. But Urnamu had succeeded in his primary goal. He had saved the memory of Sumer. Because of his laws, his Ziggurats, and his scribes, the foundations of Mesopotamian culture were preserved, ready to be inherited by the next great power to rise from the dust, the city of Babylon.
As the Sumerian Renaissance reached its intellectual height, the scholars of the Eduba turned their attention to a figure who was already ancient to them, Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk. While fragments of his adventures had been told for centuries, it was during this era that these disparate threads began to be woven into a cohesive, grand narrative. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just the world's oldest masterpiece of literature. It is a profound meditation on what it means to be human. It tells the story of a man who was 2/3 God and 1/3 man, a king of such terrifying, restless energy that his own people prayed to the gods for relief. The answer to their prayers was Enkidu, a wild man fashioned from clay, intended to be Gilgamesh's rival, but destined to become his soul's mirror and greatest friend. The journey of Gilgamesh and Enkidu is the original hero's quest. Together, they venture into the forbidden cedar forest to slay the monster Humbaba, seeking to carve their names into the cedar trees and, by extension, into history itself. They defy the gods by killing the bull of heaven, sent to punish Gilgamesh for spurning the goddess Ishtar. But the epic takes a sharp, dark turn when the gods decree that Enkidu must die as punishment for their hubris. As Gilgamesh watches his friend waste away, the invincibility of his youth shatters. For the first time, the great king of Uruk faces the worm in the wood, the terrifying reality of his own mortality. Driven by a grief that borders on madness, Gilgamesh abandons his crown and his city. He dons the skins of wild animals and wanders the wastes, searching for the secret of eternal life. His journey takes him to the ends of the earth, across the waters of death,
to find Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, the only mortal to have been granted immortality by the gods after surviving the Great Flood. It is in this section of the epic that we find the oldest account of the deluge, a story so similar to the later biblical account that its discovery in the 19th century sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology. Utnapishtim's lesson to Gilgamesh is a hard one. Death is inevitable. He tells the king that life is like the dragonfly that glints in the sun for a moment before its shadow vanishes. Even when Gilgamesh is given a chance to win immortality through a test of wakefulness, he fails, falling into a deep sleep the moment he sits down. Finally, he is given a magical plant that can restore youth, only to have it stolen by a snake while he bathes. The snake sheds its skin, achieving the very renewal Gilgamesh sought, leaving the king standing naked and empty-handed on the riverbank. The epic concludes with a moment of quiet, heavy-hearted wisdom. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, a man changed by his failures. He stands before the massive walls he had built so many years before and asks his ferryman to look at the foundations, the kilns, and the palm groves. He realizes that while he will die, the city will live on. His immortality is not found in a magical plant, but in the bricks he laid, the laws he established, and the story that we are still reading 4,000 years later. It is a transition from the heroic age of individual glory to the civilized age of communal legacy. For the Mesopotamians, Gilgamesh was the ultimate archetype. He represented the struggle between the wild, Enkidu, and the civilized, the city. He reflected their anxieties about the unpredictability of the gods and the finality of the grave. The epic served as a cultural anchor, taught to every student and referenced by every king. It provided a vocabulary for grief and a framework for understanding the limitations of power. No matter how many lands a king conquered, he was reminded by the tablets that he too would eventually be laid in the earth like a fallen ox. The survival of the epic is a miracle of clay. After the Sumerian language faded, the story was translated into Akkadian, Hittite, and Hurrian. It was expanded and polished until it reached its standard Babylonian version centuries later. The fact that we can read Gilgamesh's heartbreak today is a testament to the durability of the Mesopotamian medium. While the great wooden libraries of other cultures burned to ash, the clay tablets of Mesopotamia waited in the dirt, preserving the king's voice until the modern world was ready to hear it again.
As the sun set on the Sumerian Renaissance, the theater of power shifted upriver to a once insignificant town called Babylon. It was here that a king named Hammurabi ascended the throne in 1792 BCE. Hammurabi was a master of the long game, a patient diplomat, and a ruthless strategist who spent the first decades of his reign building bridges and digging canals, waiting for his more powerful neighbors to exhaust themselves in endless wars. When the moment was right, he struck, unifying all of Mesopotamia under the banner of the old Babylonian Empire. But Hammurabi knew that an empire won by the sword could only be kept by the pen. To bind his diverse subjects together, he created a monument that would define the concept of justice for the next 3 millennia. At the center of Babylon, Hammurabi erected a massive 7-foot-tall finger of black basalt, inscribed from top to bottom with 282 laws. At the peak of the stele,
Hammurabi is depicted standing before Shamash, the sun god and the patron of justice. The god hands the king a measuring rod and a coiled rope, the tools of a surveyor, symbolizing that the laws were not merely the king's whim, but a reflection of the divine order of the universe. This was the birth of public law. By carving the rules in stone and placing them in a public square, Hammurabi removed the law from the secret chambers of the palace and made it a visible, inescapable part of daily life. The Code of Hammurabi is most famous for its lex talionis, the law of retaliation. This is the origin of the phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If a builder constructed a house so poorly that it collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was put to death. If it killed the owner's son, the builder's son was put to death. While these punishments seem barbaric by modern standards, they were actually an attempt to limit the cycle of violence. In a world of tribal blood feuds that could last for generations, the code stepped in and said, "The punishment shall fit the crime, and no more." It was an early attempt to bring a terrifying predictability to the chaos of human conflict. However, the code was also a window into a deeply stratified society. Justice in Babylon was not blind. It was calculated based on your social standing. The laws recognized three distinct classes: the Awilu, the free-born elite, the Mushkanu, the commoners, and the Wardu, the slaves. If a nobleman blinded a commoner, he merely had to pay a fine of silver. But if he blinded another nobleman, his own eye was put out. This reflected a world where every human life had a specific legal price tag. Yet, even within this hierarchy, the code offered surprising protections. It established a minimum wage for laborers, set the interest rates on loans, and protected the property rights of women in cases of divorce or widowhood. Hammurabi's laws also delved into the minutiae of a thriving commercial empire. They covered everything from medical malpractice, penalizing surgeons whose bronze lancets caused a patient to die, to the responsibilities of boat builders and beer sellers. The code recognized the complexity of Babylonian life, where trade and agriculture were the twin pillars of survival. By standardizing the rules of commerce, Hammurabi turned his empire into a stable environment where merchants from far-off lands felt safe to do business. He was the first to realize that a predictable legal system is the best engine for economic growth. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the code was the king's stated intent to make justice visible in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak. Hammurabi styled himself as the shepherd of the people, a protector whose primary duty was to ensure that the orphan and the widow were not exploited. This was a radical shift in the philosophy of kingship. The king was no longer just a conqueror or a builder of temples. He was the ultimate guarantor of fairness. The code was his contract with his people, a promise that even the lowliest citizen could stand before the basalt steel and find the words that defended their rights. The legacy of Hammurabi's code outlived the Babylonian Empire by centuries. It became a textbook for scribes across the Near East, influencing the legal traditions of the Hittites, the Assyrians, and eventually the authors of the Hebrew Bible. It taught humanity that the law should be written, it should be public, and it should be permanent. Even as the basalt steel was eventually carried off as war booty to distant Susa, the ideas it contained had already taken root in the human consciousness. As we look at the stela of Hammurabi today, housed in the Louvre Museum, we see more than just a list of ancient punishments. we see the first blueprint for a society governed by rules rather than by men. Hammurabi proved that a great leader does not just build walls to keep enemies out, he builds a legal framework to keep his people together. The city of Babylon became the eternal city, not because of its gold, but because it was the place where humanity first decided that justice should be as solid as stone.
As the 17th century BCE dawned, the stable, bureaucratic world of Hammurabi's Babylon began to tremble. The age of the scribe was suddenly confronted by the age of the horse. From the rugged highlands of the north and east, a new kind of power was sweeping across the plains, the Mitanni. These were not traditional Mesopotamian city dwellers, but a warrior elite who had mastered a terrifying new technology that would change the face of warfare forever: the light spoke-wheeled chariot. For thousands of years, Mesopotamian armies had relied on heavy, lumbering wagons pulled by donkeys. They were slow, difficult to turn, and used primarily for transport or as elevated platforms. The Mitanni, however, introduced a revolutionary design. By using steam-bent wood to create lightweight spoke wheels and a flexible chassis, they created a vehicle that was fast, agile, and incredibly stable. Pulled by a team of highly trained horses, an animal relatively new to the Mesopotamian heartland, the Mitanni chariot was the tank of the Bronze Age. It allowed a small group of aristocrats, known as the Marianu, to dominate the battlefield, raining arrows down on infantry before disappearing in a cloud of dust. The rise of the Mitanni created a great powers era, where Mesopotamia became a giant chessboard. To the west lay the rising new kingdom of Egypt. To the north, the Hittites of Anatolia, and in the center, the Mitanni kingdom, which controlled the vital trade routes between the Mediterranean and the Tigris. This was the birth of international high-stakes diplomacy. No longer could a king like Hammurabi simply conquer his neighbors. He had to navigate a complex web of alliances, royal marriages, and brotherly letters exchanged between emperors. The Mitanni were masters of horse husbandry and training. We have recovered a famous document known as the Kikuli text, the world's oldest horse training manual. It details a rigorous, months-long regime of exercise, feeding, and grooming designed to turn a wild animal into a disciplined weapon of war. This focus on the horse changed Mesopotamian culture. The horse became a symbol of status, and the chariot warrior became a new social class, distinct from the traditional priests and merchants. The civilized world of the South was forced to adapt or be trampled. This era also saw the first true global arms race. As the Mitanni's neighbors saw the effectiveness of the chariot, they scrambled to build their own. The forests of Lebanon were harvested for cedar and oak, and the mines of the north were pushed to their limits to produce the bronze needed for scale armor and arrowheads. War was no longer a local dispute over a canal. It was a resource-intensive industry that required a vast international supply chain. Despite their military prowess, the Mitanni were not just destroyers. They acted as a cultural bridge, blending the traditions of the Indo-Aryan mountain tribes with the deep wisdom of the Mesopotamian plains. They adopted cuneiform to write their own language and worshipped a fascinating mix of ancient Mesopotamian gods and their own deities. They proved that even the most barbarian invaders could be seduced by the comforts and complexities of the land between the rivers. The Mitanni's dominance eventually faded as they were squeezed between the expanding empires of the Hittites and the newly resurgent Assyrians. But they left an indelible mark on the region. They introduced the horse,
the chariot, and a new style of aristocratic warfare that would define the Near East for the next 1,000 years. They showed that the walls of the world were no longer just the mud bricks of a city, but the mobility and speed of its defenders. As the Mitanni kingdom dissolved into the background of history, the stage was set for the rise of a much darker, much more disciplined power. The lessons of the chariot and the horse would be taken to their most terrifying extreme by a people who lived on the upper Tigris, a people who would turn Mesopotamia into a land of iron and blood.
While the southern cities of Babylon and Ur basked in the prestige of their ancient heritage, a grittier, more relentless power was forging itself in the north. This was Assyria. Perched on the upper Tigris, the Assyrians lived in a landscape of rolling hills and vulnerable borders, surrounded by hostile mountain tribes and rival empires. This neighborhood of wolves transformed the Assyrian character into something hard, disciplined, and unapologetically militaristic. They didn't just want to participate in the world, they wanted to dominate it. By the 9th century BCE, they had created the most efficient killing machine the world had ever seen, the first true military superpower. The Assyrian army was a marvel of professionalization. Unlike earlier empires that relied on seasonal peasant levies, the Assyrians maintained a permanent, standing army of specialists. They were the first to deploy units of ironclad infantry, heavy cavalry, and terrifying corps of engineers. If a city's walls were too high to climb, the Assyrians didn't just wait, they invented the heavy siege engine, massive, multi-story wooden towers on wheels, equipped with iron-tipped battering rams that could chew through mud brick walls like a predator through bone. They turned the art of the siege into a terrifying science. But the Assyrians knew that the mind was as much a battlefield as the plain. They were the masters of calculated frightfulness. Their royal inscriptions are filled with gruesome descriptions of what happened to those who resisted, flaying, impaling, and the mass deportation of entire populations. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a deliberate policy of psychological warfare. By making the cost of rebellion unthinkable, they maintained order over a vast, diverse territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Nile. They were the first to use terror as an administrative tool of statecraft. At the center of this iron-willed empire stood the king, the vice-regent of Ashur. To the Assyrians, their national god, Ashur, was a restless deity who demanded constant expansion. Peace was not seen as a virtue, it was a sign of stagnation. The king was expected to lead annual campaigns to bring order to the chaos of the periphery. This created a relentless cycle of conquest that pushed the borders of the known world further than ever before. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib, Assyria became the beating heart of a globalized economy, fueled by the tribute of 100 conquered nations. Yet there was another side to the Assyrian spirit, one of profound intellectual curiosity. In the heart of their magnificent capital, Nineveh, King Ashurbanipal created the world's first great universal library. He sent scribes to every corner of Mesopotamia to collect, translate, and copy every tablet they could find. He wanted to possess not just the land of his enemies, but their knowledge. It is thanks to Ashurbanipal's obsession that we have the most complete versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh and thousands of scientific, medical, and magical texts today. He was a man who could lead a cavalry charge in the morning and spend his evening cataloging the omens of the stars. The Assyrian Empire also pioneered the concept of the imperial province.
They built a sophisticated network of royal roads and a relay system of messengers that allowed the king to communicate with his governors in days rather than weeks. This was the first information age, where the central government could monitor taxes, troop movements, and local unrest across thousands of miles. They proved that an empire wasn't just about winning battles, it was about maintaining a constant, watchful presence. Ultimately, however, the iron will of Assyria was its own undoing. The constant wars of expansion exhausted the kingdom's resources and created a world of enemies who were only waiting for a moment of weakness. The weight of the empire's taxes and the trauma of its deportations left the subject peoples with nothing to lose. When the end finally came in 612 BCE, it was swift and total. A coalition of Medes and Babylonians swept into Nineveh, burning the great palaces to the ground. The fall of Assyria was so complete that within a generation, the locations of its great cities were forgotten, swallowed by the dust of the plains. But the Assyrians had fundamentally changed the world. They had introduced the concepts of professional armies, provincial administration, and the imperial library. They proved that human organization could reach a scale previously thought impossible. The age of iron had arrived, and though Nineveh was in ashes, the blueprint for the great empires of the future, Persia, Rome, and beyond, had been written in the blood and clay of the north.
With the fall of Nineveh, the center of gravity swung back to the south. The Neo-Babylonian Empire rose like a phoenix from the Assyrian ashes, led by the formidable Nebuchadnezzar II. He was a man obsessed with legacy, determined to transform Babylon into a city that would not just dominate the world, but would capture its imagination forever. Under his reign, Babylon became the largest and most magnificent city on the planet, a sprawling, walled metropolis of glazed blue tile, towering temples, and the legendary Hanging Gardens. The gateway to this new world was the Ishtar Gate. Clad in brilliant blue lapis lazuli-colored glazed bricks and adorned with relief sculptures of golden dragons and bulls, it served as a dazzling cytological threshold. Beyond it lay the processional way, a massive road paved with limestone and red breccia, leading the way to the Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. This was the great Ziggurat of Babylon, a structure so immense that many believe it inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar wanted the city to be more than a capital. He wanted it to be the literal center of the universe. But the crown jewel of his reign was the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Legend says Nebuchadnezzar built them for his wife, Amytis of Media, who pined for the lush green mountains of her homeland. In the middle of the flat, arid Mesopotamian plain, the king's engineers performed a miracle. They constructed massive tiered terraces of stone and brick, layered with thick lead to prevent water from leaking into the palace below. Upon these terraces, they planted entire forests of exotic trees and flowering plants. The real genius of the gardens lay in the unseen engineering. To keep this artificial mountain green, the Babylonians developed a sophisticated irrigation system. Using a series of massive Archimedes-style screws or chain pumps, they lifted water from the Euphrates high into the air, allowing it to cascade down in a series of cooling waterfalls and streams. It was the world's first true vertical forest, a triumph of human ingenuity over a harsh environment. While archaeology has yet to pinpoint the garden's exact location, the descriptions of ancient travelers paint a picture of a lush, emerald paradise
floating above the dusty streets of the city. This era was also a period of intense cultural and scientific observation. The Chaldean astronomers of Babylon reached a level of precision that would not be surpassed for 1,000 years. They were the first to understand the Saros cycle, allowing them to predict lunar eclipses with perfect accuracy. They mapped the movement of the planets with such detail that their data would eventually help 17th century astronomers like Kepler. In Babylon, science and religion were one. To understand the stars was to understand the handwriting of the gods. However, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was also a city of exile. In 586 BCE, he destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and brought thousands of Jews to Babylon in captivity. This collision of cultures had a profound impact on history. In the shadow of the Ishtar Gate and the Great Ziggurat, the Hebrew scholars began to compile and edit the texts that would become the Torah and the Old Testament. The imagery of Babylon, its luxury, its power, and its pride became a permanent fixture in Western religious and literary tradition. The city became a symbol of both human achievement and human vanity. Nebuchadnezzar's empire was a brilliant final flourish of Mesopotamian independence. He had restored the glory of Hammurabi, but the world was changing faster than even the kings of Babylon could track. To the east, a new power was rising, the Persians led by Cyrus the Great. Unlike the Assyrians, who conquered through terror, the Persians would conquer through tolerance and administrative genius. In 539 BCE, the city that was thought to be impregnable fell in a single night. Legend says the Persians diverted the Euphrates and marched into the city along the dry riverbed while the Babylonians were feasting. The handwriting on the wall had appeared, and the long 5,000-year story of independent Mesopotamia was coming to a close. Babylon would remain a jewel of the world, but it would now be a jewel in someone else's crown.
At the pinnacle of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the world witnessed a paradox. A ruler who was as comfortable at the head of a terrifying war machine as he was in the quiet sanctuary of a scriptorium. Ashurbanipal, who reigned from 668 to 631 BCE, represented the absolute intellectual peak of the Assyrian state. While his predecessors had focused almost exclusively on the expansion of borders and the extraction of tribute, Ashurbanipal realized that true power lay in the control of information. He did not merely want to rule the bodies of his subjects, he sought to possess the collective memory and the spiritual secrets of the entire Mesopotamian world, transforming the city of Nineveh into a lighthouse of ancient wisdom. Ashurbanipal's scholarly identity was unique among the kings of the ancient Near East. Unlike many monarchs who relied entirely on court scribes to interpret the world, he boasted of his own literacy. In his royal inscriptions, he claimed to have been endowed by the gods with broad understanding and a sharp eye for learning. He was capable of reading the obscure Sumerian and the complex Akkadian of the ancient tablets, languages that were already antique in his own time. This literacy granted him a direct line to the ancestors, allowing him to bypass intermediaries and engage personally with the mathematical, medical, and ritualistic texts that formed the bedrock of his civilization. Driven by an insatiable curiosity, Ashurbanipal initiated the first systematic effort to archive the sum of human knowledge. He dispatched specialized scribes across the vast reaches of Mesopotamia to the ancient temples of Babylon, Borsippa, and Nippur with a singular mission: to collect every scrap of written wisdom.
These agents were instructed to hunt for original tablets, or if the originals could not be moved, to produce meticulous copies. No subject was too small or too sacred. From astronomical observations and medical recipes to royal decrees and high literature, the knowledge was funneled back to his capital, turning Nineveh into the world's first universal information hub. The result of this grand endeavor was the Great Library of Ashurbanipal, a precursor to the Library of Alexandria and arguably the most significant intellectual achievement of the pre-classical world. Housing an estimated 30,000 clay tablets and fragments, the library was organized with a level of sophistication that mirrored modern archival standards. Tablets were categorized by genre and stored in specific rooms, often with colophons, small notes at the end of the text identifying the source of the copy and asserting the king's ownership. This was not a private hoard of a king's hobbies, but a state-sponsored attempt to centralize and protect the intellectual property of an entire millennium. Ashurbanipal's obsession with the written word extended deeply into the realm of the supernatural and the scientific. He was particularly concerned with extisipy, the reading of animal livers, and exorcism, viewing these as essential tools for state security. By collecting every known omen and ritual, he believed he could decode the intentions of the gods and protect his empire from unseen threats. However, his library also contained advanced mathematical tables, botanical lists, and chemical formulas for glassmaking, proving that his intellectual reach spanned the divide between what we would today call magic and hard science. It is thanks to this library that the world's greatest literary masterpiece, the Epic of Gilgamesh, survived in its most complete form. Ashurbanipal's scribes painstakingly copied the standard Babylonian version of the tale, ensuring that the king's personal library possessed the most definitive edition. To Ashurbanipal, owning these stories was a way of connecting his own reign to the legendary kings of the past, casting himself as the ultimate heir of the Sumerian and Akkadian heroes. He saw literature as a pillar of kingship, as vital to the stability of the realm as a well-supplied fortress. However, the image of the enlightened scholar must be balanced against the reality of the brutal conqueror. Ashurbanipal was a master of calculated frightfulness. His palace walls were decorated with reliefs depicting the gruesome torture of Elamite kings and the systematic deportation of rebellious peoples. There is a chilling intellectualism in his cruelty. He applied the same meticulous organization to his military campaigns that he did to his library. He saw no contradiction between the beauty of a Sumerian poem and the terror of a scorched earth policy. To him, both were necessary components of a divinely ordained world order. The library also served a crucial political function. It was the engine of a massive intelligence network. By centralizing all legal, historical, and geographical records, Ashurbanipal could govern his empire with unprecedented precision. He could reference historical precedents for land disputes, check the loyalty of provincial governors through past correspondence, and use astronomical records to predict the timing of agricultural cycles. The library was the brain of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a central processing unit that allowed the king to see across time and space, making him a more effective and more terrifying ruler. When Nineveh finally fell to a coalition of Medes and Babylonians in 612 BCE, the library was buried beneath the burning ruins of the North Palace. Ironically, the very fire that destroyed the city served to preserve the library. The intense heat baked the clay tablets, hardening them into permanent stone and protecting them for over 2,000 years. While the wooden scrolls of Alexandria would later burn into nothingness, the Mesopotamian clay waited in the dirt, a silent and indestructible witness to the brilliance of the Assyrian intellectual peak. Ultimately, Ashurbanipal's legacy is a testament to the durability of ideas. While his military conquests were erased within a generation, his library remains the primary source for almost everything we know about ancient Mesopotamian culture. He proved that even in an age of iron and blood, the most valuable treasure a king could gather was not gold, but the written word. Ashurbanipal was the first to realize that the archives of a civilization are its soul, and by saving the tablets of the past, he ensured that the voice of the ancient Near East would never be truly silenced.
The Neo-Assyrian army was the first truly professional military force in human history, a relentless juggernaut that transformed warfare from a seasonal hobby of kings into a terrifying year-round industry. Unlike their neighbors, who relied on peasant levies who needed to return home for the harvest, the Assyrians maintained a permanent standing army. This new organization allowed for specialized training, standardized equipment, and a level of tactical cohesion that no tribal militia or city-state guard could hope to match. By the 8th century BCE, the Assyrian king could mobilize tens of thousands of disciplined troops at a moment's notice, project power across thousands of miles, and sustain long-term campaigns that wore down even the most stubborn resistance. At the heart of their lethality was the adoption of iron. While other nations were still largely dependent on bronze, a metal that was expensive to produce and prone to bending or breaking, the Assyrians exploited the iron ore deposits in the mountains to their north. They were the first to equip entire divisions with iron-headed spears, swords, and arrowheads. This technological leap gave the Assyrian infantry a decisive edge. Their weapons were harder, sharper, and more durable than anything they faced. Clad in iron scale armor and conical helmets, the Assyrian soldier was a literal man of iron, a sight that must have been profoundly demoralizing to enemies still wielding the softer metals of the past. The Assyrians also revolutionized the combined arms approach to the battlefield. They didn't just rely on a single type of troop. They integrated heavy infantry, elite archers, and high-speed cavalry into a single, synchronized organism. Their archers, often working in pairs with a shield bearer for protection, provided a constant rain of suppression fire, while the heavy infantry formed an unbreakable wall of shields. Their cavalry, which evolved from the earlier chariot traditions into a more mobile and versatile force, could scout, flank, and pursue broken enemies with ruthless efficiency. This versatility ensured that whether they were fighting on the open plains or in rugged mountains, the Assyrians always had the right tool for the slaughter. However, the true terror of the Assyrians lay in their ability to conquer the unconquerable. Before this era, a well-walled city could often withstand a siege for years, simply outlasting the attacker's patience. The Assyrians turned the siege into a brutal science. They were the first to employ a dedicated corps of engineers whose sole job was to overcome fortifications. These specialists built massive earthen ramps to bypass high walls and dug tunnels to undermine foundations. Their arrival outside a city signaled that no wall, no matter how thick or high, could offer permanent sanctuary. The most iconic weapon in their siege arsenal was the heavy battering ram. These were not mere logs carried by men, but massive, multi-story wooden towers protected by dampened hides to resist arrow fire. Mounted on 6 wheels for mobility, they housed iron-tipped rams that swung on thick chains, capable of punching through mud brick and stone,
with rhythmic, bone-shaking force. Often, these towers featured archers in the upper stories who could clear the city walls of defenders while the ram worked below. The sight of these iron-horned monsters rolling toward a city gate was often enough to prompt an immediate, desperate surrender. The Assyrian doctrine, however, went far beyond physical destruction. It was rooted in calculated frightfulness. They understood that the cheapest victory was the one won through reputation alone. To ensure this, they utilized their state art as a medium for psychological warfare. The walls of their great palaces in Nimrud and Nineveh were lined with orthostats, massive stone reliefs that served as a visual documentary of the king's absolute power. These reliefs depicted the king not just as a ruler, but as a force of nature, single-handedly slaying lions or presiding over the systematic destruction of enemy cities. The more disturbing reliefs depicted the fate of those who dared to rebel. Scribes and artists meticulously carved scenes of prisoners being flayed alive, impaled on stakes, or led away in neck yokes. These images were not hidden in dark corners. They were placed in the throne rooms and corridors where visiting diplomats and foreign vassals were forced to wait. The message was inescapable. This is what happens to those who break their oaths to the king. By projecting an image of inevitable victory and merciless retribution, the Assyrians ensured that many cities would open their gates and pay tribute before a single arrow was ever fired. This policy of terror was often paired with the strategic use of mass deportation. When a region proved particularly troublesome, the Assyrians didn't just kill the leaders, they uprooted the entire population. Tens of thousands of people, farmers, artisans, and priests were forcibly moved across the empire to serve the needs of the Assyrian state. This demographic engineering served two purposes. It broke the national spirit of the conquered people by severing their connection to their ancestral land, and it provided the labor needed to build the king's magnificent new cities. It was a cold, efficient way of turning enemies into assets. The Assyrian army was also the backbone of the world's first true imperial administration. They built a network of royal roads and established a postal system with relay stations, allowing the king to receive intelligence and issue orders with unprecedented speed. The army didn't just conquer, it garrisoned, taxed, and monitored. This constant watchful presence meant that the Pax Assyriaca was maintained not through the consent of the governed, but through the overwhelming and ever-present threat of force. The empire was a giant armed camp governed by a logic of strength that tolerated no rivals. In the end, the very features that made the Assyrian army so terrifying were what made the empire so fragile. By ruling through fear and iron, they created a world of enemies who had nothing to lose. The constant state of war exhausted their own population and drained the treasury, while their victims waited for a single moment of royal weakness to strike back. Yet, for 3 centuries, the iron will of Assyria dominated the world, leaving behind a legacy of military organization, engineering, and psychological warfare that would be studied and emulated by every empire that followed.
By the 7th century BCE, the city of Nineveh had ascended to become the undisputed center of the known world, a sprawling metropolis that dwarfed all its predecessors. Under the ambitious reign of King Sennacherib, who moved the capital from Horsabad to Nineveh in 705 BCE, the city underwent a transformation that was as much a feat of engineering as it was an expression of imperial ego. Sennacherib didn't just want a capital, he wanted a terrestrial paradise that reflected the absolute dominion of the Assyrian state. At its height, Nineveh spanned over 1,800 acres, enclosed by a massive double wall with 15 great gates.
housing a population that some scholars estimate reached 150,000, a figure unheard of in the ancient world. The lifeblood of this massive urban expansion was Sennacherib's revolutionary approach to water management. To sustain a city of such scale in the arid plains of northern Mesopotamia, the king commissioned a staggering hydraulic project. He tapped into the fresh springs of the Zagros Mountains, miles to the north, and diverted their flow toward the city through a complex network of canals and stone-lined channels. This was not merely a local trench, it was an inland canal system of unprecedented scale, designed to ensure that Nineveh remained a lush oasis regardless of the seasonal fluctuations of the Tigris River. The crown jewel of this hydraulic network was the Jerwin Aqueduct, a massive structure built of over 2 million dressed stones. It was the world's first great aqueduct, predating the famous Roman versions by centuries. Sennacherib's engineers used waterproof bitumen and sophisticated arch-like designs to carry the mountain water across wide valleys. This steady supply of fresh, cool water allowed the king to achieve the impossible, the creation of vast botanical gardens and parks in the heart of the desert. These were not just royal retreats, but experimental stations where exotic plants and trees, captured from distant conquests, were cultivated and displayed as living trophies of empire. Sennacherib's vision for Nineveh culminated in the construction of the Southwest Palace, famously dubbed the Palace Without Rival. Built on a high terrace to dominate the skyline, the palace was a staggering complex of over 80 rooms, lined with nearly 2 miles of stone reliefs. The wealth flowing into the city from every corner of the Near East, tribute from the Phoenician coast, gold from Egypt, and timber from the Levant, was poured into its construction. The palace featured massive cedar beams from Lebanon and doors plated in gleaming bronze and silver, creating a sensory experience intended to overwhelm any visiting dignitary by the sheer weight of Assyrian prosperity. The interior of the palace functioned as a grand narrative of Sennacherib's triumphs. The orthostat reliefs here moved away from the static poses of earlier eras toward a cinematic style of storytelling. These carvings depicted the king's massive construction projects, showing thousands of laborers dragging colossal winged bull statues, lamassu, into place. By immortalizing the labor and engineering of the city itself on the walls of his home, Sennacherib was asserting that his ability to reshape the earth was just as significant as his ability to conquer nations. He was the master builder of a new cosmic order. Beyond the palace walls, Nineveh was a marvel of urban planning. Sennacherib widened the city's streets and squares, ensuring that the processional way was grand enough to accommodate the massive military parades and religious festivals that defined Assyrian public life. The city was divided into functional quarters with dedicated areas for metalworking, weaving, and commerce. This organization allowed Nineveh to function as the economic engine of the empire, a place where the raw materials of the periphery were transformed into the luxury goods and weapons that sustained the Assyrian war machine. The botanical gardens of Nineveh were so sophisticated that some modern historians believe they may have been the true inspiration for the hanging gardens traditionally attributed to Babylon. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe mountains of trees and artificial wetlands that mirrored the marshes of the south, complete with wild boars and deer. This attempt to recreate diverse ecosystems within the city walls was an act of total landscape architecture. It showed that the king of Assyria did not just rule over people, he ruled over nature itself, commanding the water to climb hills and the mountain forests to grow in the plains. This brief golden moment represented a golden moment when the Assyrian sun seemed as though it would never set. The city was a terminal for a globalized world, attracting scholars, merchants, and craftsmen from across the continent. The atmosphere in Nineveh was one of supreme confidence. The borders were secure, the granaries were full, and the gods seemed to smile upon the house of Sennacherib. It was a perfect storm of technological innovation, administrative efficiency, and military dominance, making Nineveh the undisputed cultural and political capital of the 7th century world. However, the very scale of Nineveh made it a target of immense resentment. The luxury of the palace without rival was bought with the blood and treasure of 100 conquered nations. The city's grandeur was a constant reminder to the rest of the world of their own subjugation. Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, and his grandson, Ashurbanipal, would continue to enhance the city, but the pressure on the imperial borders was beginning to mount. The city's massive size and sophisticated infrastructure required a level of constant maintenance and military protection that eventually began to strain even the formidable Assyrian treasury. As we look at the ruins of Nineveh today, largely mounds of dust near modern-day Mosul, it is hard to imagine the shimmering green and blue-tiled metropolis it once was. Yet Sennacherib's engineering legacy survived in the DNA of every great city that followed. He proved that a city could be more than just a cluster of houses. It could be a designed environment, a place where nature and technology were harnessed to serve a human vision. For that brief century, Nineveh was the pinnacle of human achievement, a city of stone and water that stood as a defiant monument to the iron will of the North.
Remains one of the most dramatic and sudden collapses in the history of human civilization. For 3 centuries, the Assyrian lion had terrorized the Near East, creating a world order based on iron-willed discipline and constant expansion of borders. However, by the late 7th century BCE, the very mechanisms that had made Assyria a superpower, its relentless militarism and centralized control, had become its greatest liabilities. The empire had become a victim of its own success, a sprawling, overstretched organism that had exhausted its manpower and its treasury in a cycle of never-ending warfare. Internal rot began with a series of devastating succession crises. After the death of Ashurbanipal, the last truly great king, the Assyrian court descended into a chaotic struggle for the throne. The empire's rigid hierarchy meant that without a strong, undisputed figure at the center, the provincial administration began to fracture. As rival princes turned the army against one another, the borders were left vulnerable. The professional standing army, once the envy of the world, was drained by civil war, leaving the heartland exposed to the enemies who had spent centuries nursing their grievances under the Assyrian yoke. While Assyria bled from within, a formidable coalition was forming without. To the south, a new and energetic dynasty had taken control of Babylon, led by Nabopolassar, who was determined to win back the independence his city had lost centuries before. To the east, the Medes, an Iranian people who had long been targets of Assyrian raids, were unifying into a potent military force under King Cyaxares. These 2 powers, traditionally rivals, realized that the only way to survive the Assyrian shadow was to unite and dismantle it entirely. In 616 BCE, they struck an alliance that signaled the beginning of the end for Nineveh. The coalition's campaign was a whirlwind of destruction that mirrored the very tactics the Assyrians had once used to conquer others.
They systematically picked off the outer bastions of the empire, moving up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. City after city that had stood for millennia, Ashur, Nimrud, and Tarbisu, fell to the combined Medo-Babylonian forces. The psychological impact was immense. The invincible Assyrians were being outmaneuvered and overwhelmed on their own soil. By 612 BCE, the coalition reached the walls of Nineveh, the most fortified and magnificent city in the world. The siege of Nineveh lasted for 3 months, a period of desperate, bloody combat. The city's massive walls and Sennacherib's sophisticated water defenses were put to the ultimate test. Legend and archaeological evidence suggest that the coalition utilized the city's own engineering against it, damming the Hauser River to cause a flood that breached the walls, or perhaps cutting off the mountain aqueducts to paralyze the defenders. When the defenses finally crumbled, the pent-up rage of the conquered nations was unleashed upon the City of Blood. The destruction of Nineveh was not just a military victory, it was a ritualistic erasure of an entire culture. The victors did not simply occupy the city, they burned the great palaces of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal to the ground. The magnificent stone reliefs showing the Assyrians flaying their enemies were smashed or defaced. The library was buried under the collapsing roofs of the North Palace. The fire was so intense that it vitrified the mud bricks, sealing the fate of the city in a tomb of ash and heat. The Lion of the North was not just defeated, it was executed. The swiftness of the collapse was staggering. Within a decade of the fall of Nineveh, the last remnants of the Assyrian army were chased into the western desert and annihilated at the Battle of Carchemish. An empire that had governed the 4 quarters of the world vanished almost overnight. The administrative network, the royal roads, and the postal system were repurposed or abandoned. The sheer totality of the ruin meant that there was no Assyrian successor state. The identity of the people was largely absorbed or scattered into the surrounding populations. So complete was the disappearance of the Assyrians that their memory began to fade from the landscape within a few generations. By 401 BCE, when the Greek explorer and mercenary Xenophon led his 10,000 past the ruins of Nineveh, which he called Mespila, he saw only a vast mound of earth and stone. He noted that the ruins were once a great city, but he attributed them to the Medes, having no knowledge of the Assyrians who had built them. The world's first military superpower had become a ghost, a myth buried so deep that it would take another 2,000 years of archaeology to bring it back to light. This vacuum of power was immediately filled by the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under Nabopolassar and his more famous son, Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon claimed the crown of Mesopotamia. They sought to distance themselves from the terror of the Assyrians, presenting themselves instead as the restorers of ancient Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. Babylon was rebuilt on a scale of unprecedented luxury, and for a final 70-year flourish, the southern city became the center of the world. The era of the Iron Will had ended, and the era of the Golden City had begun. The fall of Assyria remains a cautionary tale about the sustainability of power. It proved that an empire built solely on the foundation of fear and military extraction cannot withstand the pressure of its own weight once the central authority falters. The Assyrians had taught the world how to organize, how to record, and how to fight, but they had failed to teach it how to live in peace. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of Nineveh, the Mesopotamian world was forever changed, moving away from the brutal efficiency of the north towards the final shimmering grandeur of the Babylonian sunset.
The Neo-Babylonian Empire reached its unparalleled peak under Nebuchadnezzar II, a ruler who combined the tactical cunning of a conqueror with the visionary ambition of a master architect. Ascending the throne in 605 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar inherited a kingdom that had recently helped topple the Assyrian Empire, but he was not content with merely being a successor to Nineveh. He sought to revive the ancient prestige of the southern plains, turning Babylon into a city that was not just a seat of power, but a manifestation of the divine order. His reign was a deliberate attempt to outshine the legacy of Hammurabi, rebranding Babylon as the eternal city of the ancient world. To fund his massive architectural dreams, Nebuchadnezzar expanded the empire's borders through a series of relentless military campaigns. He pushed Babylonian influence to the very edges of Egypt, securing vital trade routes and extracting tribute from the Levant. His most historically significant military action was the siege and eventual destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. By destroying the temple and forcibly deporting the Jewish elite, artisans, and scholars to Babylon, he intended to neutralize a rebellious province. However, this Babylonian captivity unwittingly turned his capital into a melting pot of cultures, where the traditions of the Hebrews collided with the cosmic science of the Chaldeans. Under Nebuchadnezzar's direction, Babylon became the largest and most sophisticated urban center on Earth. He surrounded the city with a double system of massive walls, so wide that ancient historians claimed 2 four-horse chariots could pass each other on top. These walls were punctuated by 8 monumental gates, the most famous of which was the Ishtar Gate. Clad in vibrant blue glazed bricks and adorned with golden reliefs of dragons, mushushu, and bulls, the gate served as a sensory gateway to a city that felt like a glimpse of heaven on earth. It was a masterpiece of prestige architecture designed to leave every visitor breathless. The city's economic power was rooted in its role as a global marketplace. Nebuchadnezzar standardized the weights and measures of the empire, facilitating a surge in international trade. Merchants from as far as the Indus Valley and the Mediterranean met in the bustling quays of the Euphrates, which flowed through the heart of the city. Babylon was the terminal for the world's wealth. The perfumes of Arabia, the cedar of Lebanon, and the silver of Anatolia all found their way into the city's markets. This economic vitality supported a massive class of professional scribes, bankers, and artisans, making Babylon the first truly globalized commercial hub. Religion and science were the twin pillars of Nebuchadnezzar's cultural program. He prioritized the restoration of the Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. This staggering 7-story ziggurat was dedicated to Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. Rising nearly 300 feet into the air, it was the literal and metaphorical center of the city. To the Babylonians, the ziggurat was a staircase for the gods. To the rest of the world, it became the Tower of Babel, a symbol of human ambition attempting to pierce the heavens. The rituals performed atop this mountain of brick were synchronized with the movements of the stars, reflecting the king's obsession with celestial harmony. The Hanging Gardens, the most elusive of the 7 wonders, were said to be Nebuchadnezzar's most personal project. Whether they were built for his Median queen, Amytis, or served as a royal hunting park, they represented the pinnacle of Babylonian irrigation technology. The gardens were an engineered paradise, a series of tiered terraces that defied the arid landscape of the riverbanks. This achievement highlighted the Babylonian mastery of the environment, proving that the king could command the water to flow upward and the mountain forests to flourish in the desert. It was a vertical forest
that symbolized the total control of nature by the crown. Intellectually, this era was a Babylonian Renaissance. The scholars of the court reached new heights in astronomy and mathematics, refining the calculation of planetary movements and the prediction of eclipses. They were the world's most sophisticated data scientists, recording celestial omens on thousands of tablets to guide the king's decisions. This intellectual prestige made Babylon a university city, attracting the brightest minds of the era. The Chaldean priests became the gatekeepers of a mathematical language that would eventually travel to Greece and form the basis of Western astronomy and astrology. However, the sheer splendor of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon carried within it the seeds of its own mythological downfall. To the conquered peoples living within its walls, the city was a golden cup filled with both wine and poison. The luxury, the polytheistic rituals, and the absolute power of the king made Babylon a symbol of human decadence and hubris in the eyes of the biblical prophets. This narrative of Babylon the Great as a site of moral decay was born from the trauma of exile, creating a historical double image of the city, a pinnacle of civilization to some and a pit of iniquity to others. Nebuchadnezzar's reign lasted for 43 years, a period of relative stability that allowed his grand vision to take firm root. He left behind a city that was a museum of Mesopotamian history, filled with the artifacts and styles of 3,000 years of ancestors. He was the ultimate curator of the past, ensuring that every brick in his walls was stamped with his name, asserting his place in a lineage that stretched back to the beginning of time. For this brief golden century, Babylon was the undisputed heart of the world, a city so brilliant it seemed immune to the passage of time. The tragedy of Nebuchadnezzar's era is that it was a final, magnificent sunset. The king had built a city that was a work of art, but he could not insulate it from the shifting geopolitics of the East. Within 25 years of his death, the gates he had built for Marduk would open for Cyrus the Great. Yet the legacy of Nebuchadnezzar survived the fall of his empire. His blue gates, his soaring ziggurats, and his legal and scientific systems became the templates for the Persian and Hellenistic worlds. He had succeeded in his primary goal. He had made Babylon unforgettable.
To pass through the gates of Babylon during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II was to experience the first true psychological masterpiece of urban design. For a traveler arriving from the dusty, sun-bleached plains of Mesopotamia, the sudden emergence of the city must have felt like a desert mirage solidified into stone. At the center of this vision stood the Ishtar Gate, a structure so vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Clad in millions of glazed bricks of a deep, supernatural lapis lazuli blue, the gate functioned as a chromatic shock, signaling that the traveler had crossed the threshold from the mundane world into a realm governed by divine favor and imperial wealth. The color blue was not an accidental choice. It was the most expensive and sacred pigment in the ancient world. Real lapis lazuli had to be imported from the distant mountains of modern-day Afghanistan, making it a material reserved for the jewelry of gods and kings. By engineering a glaze that mimicked this precious stone on a monumental scale, Babylonian chemists achieved a feat of industrial alchemy. This dream of blue was a display of technological dominance, proving that the king of Babylon could command the very elements to cloak his city in the colors of the heavens. Decorating this blue expanse were rows of alternating golden-yellow reliefs, the fierce bull of Adad, the storm god, and the enigmatic Mushushu, a dragon with the scales of a serpent, the talons of an eagle,
and the mane of a lion. These creatures were not merely decorative, they were the spirit guardians of the city. As a visitor walked toward the gate, the eyes of these mythical beasts followed them, serving as a silent warning. To the faithful, they were protectors. To the enemy, they were a terrifying reminder that the gods of Babylon were awake and watchful. Beyond the gate stretched the processional way, a massive paved boulevard that served as the spine of the city. This was the most grand road in the ancient world, over 60 feet wide and lined with high walls of the same shimmering blue tile. These walls were adorned with 60 lions on each side, the sacred animal of Ishtar, the goddess of war and love. Walking this path, a visitor was literally flanked by a pride of golden lions, creating a corridor of power that funneled all movement toward the religious heart of the empire. The engineering of the processional way was as impressive as its art. The road was paved with massive slabs of limestone and red breccia, set in a thick bed of bitumen to ensure it would never sink into the soft river soil. The slabs were inscribed on their undersides with a hidden message from Nebuchadnezzar: "I paved the road of Babylon with mountain stone for the procession of the great Lord Marduk." This was a road built for eternity, designed to withstand the weight of royal chariots and the rhythmic thumping of thousands of feet during the New Year's festivals. The gate and the road acted as a physical narrative of the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. As the king and the priests carried the statues of the gods along the processional way, they were symbolically reenacting Marduk's victory over the forces of chaos. For the average citizen, the architecture was a form of living scripture. One did not just hear the myths, one walked through them. The deep blue of the walls represented the primordial waters, while the golden animals represented the order the gods had imposed upon the universe. To enter through the Ishtar Gate was to receive a profound message of civilization. In the ancient mind, the wilderness was a place of lawlessness, demons, and unpredictability. Babylon, by contrast, was the center of the world. The transition from the brown and beige of the surrounding countryside to the intense lapis blue of the gate was a sensory declaration that the visitor was now under the protection of a structured, legal, and divinely sanctioned society. Inside these walls, the calculated frightfulness of the Assyrians was replaced by a sense of overwhelming golden stability. The destination of this blue path was the Etemenanki, the great Ziggurat, and the temple of Marduk, the Esagila. As the visitor moved deeper into the city, the Ishtar Gate served as the vanishing point behind them, a glowing blue portal that separated the sacred interior from the profane exterior. The architecture was designed to humble the individual, making them feel small in the face of the state's majesty, yet also proud to be part of a civilization that could produce such wonders. This dream of blue also served an international purpose. Babylon was a city of trade and diplomacy, and the Ishtar Gate was its primary advertisement. Merchants from the Mediterranean, diplomats from Egypt, and exiles from Judea all passed through this gate. They would carry the story of the Blue City back to their homelands, cementing Babylon's reputation as the jewel of the East. Even today, the excavated remnants of the gate in Berlin continue to exert this same psychological power, drawing millions to stare at the prehistoric blue. Ultimately, the Ishtar Gate was Nebuchadnezzar's way of defying time. He knew that empires were fragile, but he believed that beauty was a form of immortality. By cladding his city in the colors of the sky and the guardians of the gods, he created an entrance that outlasted the fall of his dynasty. The gate remains the ultimate symbol of the Babylonian zenith, a moment when humanity used art, chemistry, and engineering to build a doorway into the civilized universe, inviting the world to walk through a dream of blue.
The Hanging Gardens of Babylon stand as the most enigmatic entry on the list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Unlike the pyramids of Giza or the lighthouse of Alexandria, which left behind substantial ruins or detailed contemporary accounts, the gardens exist primarily in the amber of legend. According to the most popular tradition, King Nebuchadnezzar II commissioned this botanical marvel around 600 BCE to cure the homesickness of his wife, Amatis of Media. Having been raised in the lush, tiered greenery of the Persian highlands, she found the flat, arid, and dusty plains of Mesopotamia unbearable. The gardens were therefore an act of imperial love, a king's attempt to relocate an entire mountain landscape into the heart of a desert metropolis. The hanging nature of the gardens did not imply they were suspended by ropes, but rather that they were overhanging, built upon a series of massive stepped terraces. Ancient historians like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo described a structure that resembled a green mountain of masonry. These terraces were reportedly held up by a complex system of stone pillars and vaults, creating a tiered platform that rose nearly 75 feet into the air. To prevent water from seeping through and rotting the foundations, the Babylonians used layers of reeds, bitumen, and thick lead plates, a sophisticated waterproofing technique that allowed for the planting of deep-rooted trees high above the ground. The botanical diversity within the gardens was a testament to the reach of the Babylonian Empire. It was not merely a local park, but a universal garden containing flora gathered from every corner of the known world. Exotic fruit trees, flowering vines, and tall cedars were carefully cultivated in the artificial soil of the terraces. For the citizens of Babylon, the sight of a forest floating above the city walls was a miracle of unnatural beauty. It was a sensory overload of scent and color that defied the monotonous beige of the surrounding floodplains, providing a cooling microclimate that offered a literal breath of fresh air in the sweltering Mesopotamian heat. The true marvel, however, was the engineering required to keep such a paradise alive. In a land where rain was scarce and the sun was punishing, a vertical forest required constant, high-volume irrigation. It is believed the Babylonians employed a massive mechanical system to lift water from the Euphrates River to the highest terrace. This likely involved a chain pump, a series of buckets on a rotating belt, or an early version of the Archimedes screw. This water would then be channeled into a network of artificial streams and fountains that cascaded down the levels, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of falling water and rising mist. Despite these vivid descriptions, the Hanging Gardens remain an archaeological ghost. Decades of excavations in Babylon have unearthed the Ishtar Gate and the foundations of the Great Ziggurat, but not a single trace of the gardens has been found. This lack of evidence has led to a fascinating academic debate. Some historians suggest the gardens were purely mythical, a literary trope used by Greek writers to symbolize the ultimate luxury of the East. Others argue that they were real, but simply have been lost to the shifting sands and the erosive power of the Euphrates, which has changed its course many times since antiquity. A compelling modern theory, championed by scholar Stephanie Dalley, suggests that the mystery is a case of mistaken identity. She argues that the gardens actually existed in Nineveh, not Babylon. King Sennacherib of Assyria, who reigned a century before Nebuchadnezzar, left behind detailed inscriptions describing a palace without rival and a massive garden that utilized sophisticated aqueducts and water-raising screws. Since the Greeks often confused the two great Mesopotamian capitals,
The glory of the Assyrian garden may have been retroactively attributed to the more famous city of Babylon. Regardless of their physical location, the myth of the gardens represents the ultimate Mesopotamian triumph, the mastery of the environment. In the cradle of civilization, survival depended on the ability to control the Tigris and Euphrates. The Hanging Gardens were the aesthetic peak of this struggle. By turning a barren desert into a lush, vertical paradise, the Mesopotamians proved that human ingenuity could override the limitations of nature. They weren't just farmers, they were landscape hackers who could bend the elements to their will, creating beauty where none should exist. The gardens also served a profound political purpose. An empire that can create a mountain in the desert is an empire that can do anything. The gardens were a display of soft power, signaling to every diplomat and merchant that the king held the keys to life and growth. To walk through the terraces was to walk through a controlled world where the chaos of the wild had been tamed and organized. It was a physical manifestation of the king's role as the good shepherd, the one who ensures that his people and his land are nourished and green. In the cultural memory of the West, the gardens became the archetype for the paradise garden. The imagery of tiered greenery and cascading water influenced everything from Persian paradisa, from which we get the word paradise, to hanging gardens of the Renaissance and modern sustainable skyscrapers. The concept of the urban oasis, a green lung in the center of a dense concrete or brick environment, finds its earliest and most ambitious expression in these elusive Mesopotamian terraces. We continue to chase the dream of the hanging gardens in every park and botanical conservatory we build.
In the final centuries of Mesopotamian independence, the intellectual focus of the region underwent a profound shift. While the early history of the land between the rivers was defined by the clatter of chariots and the expansion of borders, the Neo-Babylonian and early Persian periods saw the sword yield to the stylus. The Chaldean astronomers, a class of priest scholars dedicated to the god Marduk, transformed the rooftops of their ziggurats into the world's most advanced laboratories. They moved beyond simple stargazing to create a rigorous mathematical science, treating the heavens as a celestial archive that held the secrets of the future and the laws of the universe. To these astronomers, the night sky was not a chaotic void, but a heavenly writing, Shitir Shameh, a giant tablet inscribed by the gods themselves. They believed that the movements of the planets and the sun were a divine language that could be decoded through patient, systematic observation. This belief drove them to keep the astronomical diaries, the longest-running continuous scientific project in human history. For over 600 years, day and night, they recorded the positions of the moon and planets, the weather, and even the price of grain, looking for the underlying patterns that connected the movements of the stars to the fate of the Earth. The greatest achievement of this era was the development of mathematical astronomy. The Chaldeans were the first to move away from purely visual observations toward a predictive system based on complex arithmetic. They discovered the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years that allowed them to predict the recurrence of solar and lunar eclipses with startling accuracy. This was a revolutionary moment in human thought. By realizing that the heavens operated on predictable, repeating cycles, the Babylonians effectively removed the stars from the realm of whim and placed them into the realm of law. This mastery of time led to the creation of the zodiac system,
that remains a cultural staple today. Around the 5th century BCE, Babylonian astronomers divided the sky into 12 equal segments of 30 degrees each, naming them after the constellations that occupied those spaces. This coordinate system provided a universal map for tracking the wandering stars, the planets. When you speak of Aries, Leo, or Scorpio, you are using the specific celestial shorthand developed by men who watched the sky from the terraces of Babylon over 2,500 years ago. The Chaldean scientists also perfected the sexagesimal base 60 system, applying it to the geometry of the circle. They were the first to divide a circle into 360 degrees, an innovation that remains the standard for global navigation and geometry today. This mathematical framework allowed them to calculate the varying speed of the moon across the sky, a concept that required a primitive form of calculus. They didn't have the symbolic algebra we use today, but their use of arithmetic progressions allowed them to solve problems that would baffle most ancient civilizations. Their observations were so precise that they were able to calculate the length of the synodic month, the time from one new moon to the next, within a few seconds of the modern value. This accuracy was not merely for academic interest, it was essential for the Babylonian calendar, which relied on the lunar cycle but had to be reconciled with the solar year. By mastering the intercalation of extra months, the astronomers ensured that religious festivals and agricultural harvests remained in sync, a vital necessity for the stability of the state. While their motivations were often astrological, seeking to warn the king of impending doom or favorable omens, their methods were purely scientific. They were the first to understand that the universe was a machine of numbers. This Chaldean wisdom became so famous that in the later Roman and Greek worlds, the word Chaldean became synonymous with astronomer or mathematician. Even after the political fall of Babylon, the city remained a prestigious center of learning, a university town where scholars from across the Mediterranean came to consult the ancient archives. The data gathered by these scribes provided the essential raw material for the later breakthroughs of Greek science. Hipparchus, the father of trigonometry, and Ptolemy, whose geocentric model dominated the Middle Ages, relied heavily on Babylonian eclipse records and planetary tables. Without the centuries of data meticulously recorded on clay tablets in Nineveh and Babylon, the Greeks would not have had the empirical foundation necessary to develop their own sophisticated models of the solar system. This intellectual legacy eventually flowed into the Islamic Golden Age. Medieval Arabic astronomers inherited the Babylonian base 60 math and their stellar catalogs, refining them into the systems that guided explorers across the oceans. The very terminology of modern astronomy, from the degrees of a circle to the names of many stars, contains the DNA of the Chaldean priests. They were the bridge between the prehistoric wonder of the sky and the modern science of the cosmos, proving that the ultimate power of Mesopotamia was not its iron weapons, but its ability to read the universe.
The independent history of Mesopotamia did not end with the crashing of siege engines or the collapsing of walls, but with a quiet, strategic masterstroke that caught the world's most magnificent city in a moment of intoxicated vulnerability. By 539 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was a house divided. King Nabonidus, an eccentric and scholarly ruler, had spent a decade in the Arabian desert,
neglecting the vital New Year's festivals of Marduk and alienating the powerful Babylonian priesthood. In his absence, the city was governed by his son, Belshazzar, who presided over a capital that felt impregnable but was politically and spiritually hollow. To the east, a new kind of conqueror had emerged, Cyrus the Great of Persia. Cyrus was not a traditional destroyer of cities like the Assyrians. He was a master of psychological warfare and a pioneer of religious tolerance, presenting himself not as an invader, but as a liberator. As the Persian army approached the massive walls of Babylon, walls so thick they were considered impossible to breach, Cyrus knew that a direct assault would be a bloody and perhaps futile endeavor. He needed a way to bypass the gates without alerting the massive garrison within. The Euphrates River, the very lifeblood of Babylon, flowed directly through the center of the city, passing under heavily fortified water gates. These gates were the city's only Achilles heel. Legend, recorded by the Greek historian Herodotus, tells of an audacious engineering feat. The Persians spent weeks digging a massive trench or a series of basins upstream to divert the flow of the river into a nearby marsh or lake. As the water level dropped, the riverbed, usually a deep and deadly barrier, transformed into a muddy road leading straight into the heart of the metropolis. The timing was calculated with lethal precision. Cyrus chose to strike during a great religious festival, a night when the city's guards and nobility were distracted by revelry. According to the biblical account in the book of Daniel, Belshazzar was hosting a lavish banquet, drinking from the gold vessels looted from the Temple of Jerusalem, when the handwriting on the wall appeared, prophesying the end of his kingdom. Whether through divine omen or tactical brilliance, the reality was the same. While the elite feasted, the Persian vanguard was wading through the knee-deep muck of the dry riverbed. Because the city was in the midst of a festival, many of the inner river gates had been left unlocked or were poorly guarded. The Persian soldiers slipped into the city almost unnoticed. The fall of Babylon was so swift and so quiet that, according to some accounts, those living in the center of the city did not even know the outskirts had been taken until hours later. There was no desperate last stand, no burning of the great ziggurat, and no slaughter in the streets. Babylon, the jewel of the East, fell without a fight. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel discovered in the ruins of the city, provides the Persian version of this event. In it, Cyrus claims that Marduk, the god of Babylon, had grown weary of Nabonidus and personally took Cyrus by the hand to lead him into the city. By framing his conquest as a divine appointment, Cyrus won over the local priesthood and the population. He forbade his soldiers from looting and immediately ordered the restoration of the temples. This was the birth of a new imperial philosophy: rule through integration rather than intimidation. The peaceful transition of power marked the end of an era that had begun 5,000 years earlier in the marshes of Eridu. For the first time in history, the land between the rivers was no longer ruled by its own people. The torch of power had passed from the Semitic-speaking Babylonians to the Indo-European Persians. While the culture, the mathematics, and the language of Mesopotamia would persist for centuries, the political independence of the city-states was gone forever. Babylon became a prestigious provincial capital, the winter residence of the Persian kings, but it was no longer the center of a sovereign empire. Cyrus's first act of mercy was the reversal of Nebuchadnezzar's deportation policy. He issued a decree allowing the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This act of human rights earned him a unique place in history as a Messiah figure in the Hebrew tradition. It also proved that the Persian Empire would be built on a foundation of diverse, autonomous cultures held together by a centralized, tolerant administration. The Age of Iron was being replaced by the Age of Satrapy. The fall of Babylon also set the stage for the eventual arrival of the West. 2 centuries later, Alexander the Great would follow the same path as Cyrus, entering Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a man obsessed with its ancient glory. Alexander intended to make Babylon the capital of his own global empire, but he died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar before his dream could be realized. From the Persians to the Greeks, and later the Romans and Parthians, Babylon remained a prize to be won, a city whose name still carried the weight of the original civilization. The end of independent Mesopotamia was a quiet closing of a door. The lion had been tamed not by force, but by the shifting tides of history and the clever diversion of a river. As the Persian banners were raised over the Ishtar Gate, the world transitioned from the ancient to the classical era. The lessons of the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians were now part of a global heritage, carried by their conquerors to the 4 corners of the earth. The independent heart of the rivers had stopped beating, but its echoes would shape every civilization that followed.
The story of Mesopotamia is often told as a chronicle of vanished empires and buried cities, but to view it as a dead civilization is to misunderstand the very fabric of our modern existence. Mesopotamia did not die, it dissolved, becoming the invisible foundation upon which the edifice of the Western and Eastern worlds was built. Like a river that disappears underground only to feed a distant spring, the innovations forged in the mud of the Tigris and Euphrates continue to flow through our daily lives. We are not merely students of their history, we are the active users of their technology, their logic, and their dreams. Every time we check our watches or glance at a clock, we are engaging in a ritual established by Sumerian priests over 5,000 years ago. Their decision to use a sexagesimal, base 60 system, driven by the mathematical elegance of a number divisible by almost everything, gave us the 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour. While other ancient systems faded into obscurity, the Mesopotamian division of time proved so practical that it survived the fall of Babylon, the rise of Rome, and the Industrial Revolution. Our very perception of the passing day is a rhythmic echo of the ancient heartbeat of Uruk. The physical landscape of the modern world is equally indebted to the land between the rivers. The Mesopotamians were the first to move beyond the village, creating the concept of the city as a designed environment. They pioneered the use of the kiln-fired brick, a technology that allowed for the construction of multi-story buildings and massive defensive walls. When we walk through the canyons of a modern metropolis, we are inhabiting an architectural evolution that began with the first Ziggurats. They taught us how to live together in large numbers, managing the complexities of sanitation, supply chains, and urban planning. Our sense of justice and the rule of law is perhaps the most profound of these inheritances. When we enter a courtroom today, we stand in a tradition that was codified by Hammurabi on a black basalt steel. The Mesopotamians were the first to insist that the law should be public, written, and permanent, a shield that protected the weak from the arbitrary whims of the powerful. The shift from might makes right to a system of standardized justice was the true birth of civil society. Every contract we sign and every legal right we claim is a ghost of a cuneiform tablet stamped with a cylinder seal.
The intellectual tools we use to navigate the universe were also forged in the tablet houses of the ancient Near East. The Mesopotamians were the world's first data scientists, meticulously recording the movements of the stars to find the underlying patterns of nature. They gave us the 360-degree circle and the zodiac, providing the map that would eventually lead explorers across the oceans and astronauts into space. Their commitment to observation and record-keeping was the primordial spark of the scientific method, proving that the world was not a place of random chaos, but a machine of numbers. In the realm of the spirit, the Mesopotamians provided the hero's journey that still defines our literature and film. The Epic of Gilgamesh established the template for the adventurer who seeks immortality only to find wisdom in his own mortality. This narrative arc, the departure, the supernatural struggle, and the return of the changed hero, is the DNA of everything from the Odyssey to Star Wars. They were the first to use the written word to explore the human condition, proving that while our bodies are made of clay, our stories can outlast the stars. The very act of writing, the medium through which you are reading these words, is a Mesopotamian gift. By transitioning from simple tokens to complex cuneiform symbols, they broke the sound barrier of human communication. They realized that ideas could be detached from the human voice and stored across time and space. This was the original information revolution, making possible the accumulation of knowledge, the administration of vast territories, and the preservation of history. Without the reeds and clay of the Sumerian scribes, the collective memory of the human race would be a fraction of what it is today. Mesopotamia also taught us the hard lessons of the Anthropocene, the era in which humans reshaped the earth. They were the first to face the consequences of large-scale irrigation, struggling with soil salinization and the depletion of resources. Their ruins of their cities, now standing in desolate deserts that once were lush gardens, serve as a silent warning about the fragility of our relationship with the environment. Their history is a cautionary tale of how the same ingenuity that builds a civilization can also inadvertently sow the seeds of its ecological collapse. Despite the fact that the Ziggurats are now dust and the great canals are filled with sand, the essence of the land between the rivers remains the silent ancestor of the modern world. We see it in the blue-glazed tiles of modern architecture, hear it in the 60-second ticking of our clocks, and feel it in the weight of the laws that govern our behavior. The Mesopotamian experiment was the version 1.0 of humanity's attempt to be civilized, and almost every subsequent update has been built upon that original brilliant code. As we look back at the 5,000 years of history that began in the marshes of Eridu, we realize that the cradle is never truly empty. The Mesopotamians were the pioneers who first dared to imagine a world of order, beauty, and permanence. They were the ones who moved us from the now into the forever, and as long as humans live in cities, write stories, and look at the stars, the legacy of the Tigris and Euphrates will continue to shape the destiny of our species.